This year marks the 30th anniversary of the Resident Evil franchise, and it doesn't immediately hit you until you start breaking down everything that's happened. 30 years of fleeing from zombies, lickers, tyrants, and other horrors. 30 years of unraveling the machinations of Umbrella, its remnants, and all of the other corporations that rose up to take its place. But most importantly, 30 years of survivors, from Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine to Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield, to the likes of Rebecca Chambers, Sherry Birkin, Ada Wong, Ethan Winters, and many more. It's almost difficult to believe that the series has been running for this long, and even more so that it remained relevant and stood out as gaming's definitive survival horror experience. Whether we're ready or not, it all comes to a head with the launch of Resident Evil Requiem for Xbox Series X and S, PS5, PC, and Nintendo Switch 2. But before that, we've compiled the stories of every single major Resident Evil title, all 17 parts, so you can marathon them in one single go. And if that's not enough, there's an 18th part, an exclusive bonus to this compilation at the end. So without further ado, let's dive straight in. Now before we begin, this video is based on our understanding of Resident Evil's story and lore, and it reflects our interpretation of its events as a refresher before Resident Evil Requiem. As always, we recommend that you make your own informed call by looking into the series yourself and ensuring that it matches your expectations, standards, and personal values. And just a reminder, this is a newly edited, restructured, and expanded version of our recap from a few years back, now in 4K and 60 FPS, and new details added. This recap consists of Outbreak, Outbreak File Number 2, Umbrella Chronicles, and Dark Side Chronicles as new additions to this series. The Umbrella Corporation. It only makes sense that we start with Umbrella Corporation, which is, for the most part, always central to most of the major events that take place in the Resident Evil universe. But Umbrella's story stretches further back than even Resident Evil 0 by quite a stretch. To understand the nefarious company's origins, we have to go back to 1962. Specifically, we have to talk about three pivotal figures in Resident Evil canon: Dr. Oswell E. Spencer, Dr. Edward Ashford, and Dr. James Marcus. Still young and early in their careers at this time, the three scientists learn about a West African wildflower known as Stairway of the Sun, which is said to bestow superhuman powers to those who consume it. Research and study of the legend leads the three scientists to learn that there really is some truth to it as it turns out. Those who consume it do indeed get certain powers, which are derived from a mutagenic viral infection in the flower. Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus name this virus the progenitor virus, and arrive at the conclusion that the flower can be used to create an improved and superior form of humans. Unsurprisingly though, further research into the flower and the progenitor requires constant and healthy funding, which is where Umbrella comes in. Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus set up a pharmaceutical company called Umbrella Corporation, with their goal being to use the money that they make from it to fund their progenitor research. That's not where they stop either. They find additional, more questionable sources of revenue when they enter the world of selling bioorganic weapons, or BOWs, and begin selling the progenitor virus to the United States military. It pays off, however, because Umbrella and its founders begin making money hand over fist. Using some of that money, Spencer builds a state-of-the-art lab in the Arklay Mountains, just outside of Raccoon City. The purposes of this lab are sketchy at best, though, and it's very much in Spencer's best interest that its existence remains unknown to everyone. As such, he hires architect George Trevor to build a massive, labyrinthine, elaborate mansion right on top of the lab, with its purpose being to keep the lab and all of the work that goes on within it safe and secret. Trevor himself suffers a gnarly fate. As time progresses and Umbrella grows, the partnership between its three founders begins to crumble. Though they were once partners, with time Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus turn into fierce competitors. Each spends years conducting independent research into the progenitor virus, essentially being locked in a bioweapons arm race against one another. In 1968, in fact, Ashford is killed under inexplicable circumstances, though the Ashford family is something that we'll be speaking about in much greater detail when we get to Resident Evil Code Veronica, so for now, let's just file that one away. The main players. Here we jump forward in time to 1978, a year that proves to be a significant one in Resident Evil lore, thanks to Dr. James Marcus making massive breakthroughs with his research, with the help of a promising researcher named Albert Wesker, and a brilliant young scientist named William Birkin, both of whom we'll be talking about in much greater detail across the series. The result of that said breakthrough is the T-virus, a much deadlier bioweapon created by fusing the progenitor virus with leech DNA. And what exactly does it do? Well, rather than straight out killing those it infects, the T-virus keeps them around after a cardiac arrest with severe damage of all forms, turning them into thoughtless, cannibalistic, ferocious monsters. And yes, that in a nutshell means it turns them into zombies. As you would expect, Marcus's breakthrough catches Spencer's attention, and he's far from happy. Both scientists remain in high positions at Umbrella, and their rivalry persists still. As such, desperate to ensure that Marcus doesn't overshadow and topple him, Spencer begins taking measures to ensure his supremacy. What steps exactly? Well, let's pause here for a bit and talk about someone we brought up earlier, because this person goes on to be a major part of Spencer's aforementioned plans. We're, of course, talking about Albert Wesker. Albert Wesker. Let's go back to his childhood. Trust us, it is important. As a child, he was one of many who were targeted and later abducted by Umbrella under Spencer's orders because of what were deemed to be superior genes and intellect. These children became Spencer's test subjects to work on with the progenitor virus, with his ultimate goal being, of course, to create a superior species of humans. The program was dubbed Project W, named after the man heading it up, one Dr. Wesker. In fact, not only did Spencer name the project after him, he also gave the name Wesker to all of the children he abducted. These children, including Albert Wesker, were contained in controlled environments where they would receive the best education and training, but were also constantly brainwashed by Spencer. All children were also infected with a prototype virus derived from the progenitor, though only 7% of them survived. Of that small batch of survivors, the one that caught Spencer's eye the most was Albert Wesker, who would go on to join Umbrella as a promising researcher upon turning 17 in 1977. And now, having helped Dr. James Marcus with the creation of the T-virus, along with William Birkin, Wesker becomes central to Spencer's plans for seizing full control and eliminating Marcus. Wesker and Birkin are both poached by Spencer, and it's not long before he has their complete and absolute loyalty. Shortly afterward, he orders the two to assassinate Marcus, orders that they follow without hesitation. While Marcus is in the middle of experimenting with a queen leech that he has injected with the T-virus, he's attacked and killed by Wesker and Birkin. From that point on, both characters continue to take leaps. By 1996, Wesker had joined a special division in the Raccoon City Police Department, Special Tactics and Rescue Services, or STARS, an elite force that sits high up on the pecking order within the RPD, just to say the least. Wesker functions primarily as an undercover plant for Umbrella, with his priority always being to ensure that RPD doesn't look into Umbrella or Spencer and their work too closely. By 1998, Wesker became the captain of STARS, though we'll get to all of that a little later. William Birkin's further role. Birkin, who, with Spencer's support, steals all of Marcus's work and takes credit for it. He continues that work and takes it forward, and a lot of his work ends up hinging around a key subject named Lisa Trevor. And so, who is Lisa Trevor? Well, this is where we go back to George Trevor, the architect who built Spencer Mansion in the Arklay Mountains. Shortly after construction was completed, Trevor, his wife Jessica, and their daughter Lisa were invited to the mansion by Spencer under the pretext of celebrating the architect's work. Both George and Jessica Trevor were killed, however, with Spencer wanting to ensure that they would never be able to reveal the mansion's secrets, including, of course, the lab underneath. Their daughter Lisa, meanwhile, was taken captive. Years later, she's still alive, but not in great condition, to put it mildly, having been basically a lab rat for years. After James Marcus's assassination, through a convoluted series of events, William Birkin ends up getting his paws on Lisa Trevor as well, with the intent of using her as a test subject for one of his own experiments. The results of that experiment? Hideous and terrifying. With a mutated cocktail of the progenitor virus and the monstrosity that Lisa had been turned into, Birkin creates a new and deadly strain known as the G virus, capable of evolving those that it infects, creating new and mutated life forms, and even repairing cells. And what became of Lisa Trevor? Well, we're going to get into that when we talk about Resident Evil 1. Birkin, meanwhile, reaps the benefits of having created the G virus. Spencer invests in him heavily, creating a whole new underground lab called Nest right underneath Raccoon City and putting Birkin and his wife Annette in charge, where they have everything that they need to continue their work. Okay, we think that might be enough lore and backstory for now, but there is of course still a lot to go through, and we'll be coming back to many of these characters and details in future parts, but for now, it's time to skip forward to 1998 and the events of Resident Evil 0, which begins with a mysterious attack on an Umbrella-owned train by a swarm of leeches, and at the same time, mysterious reports of cannibalistic attacks in the Arklay Mountains, following which a STAR squad is dispatched by the RPD to investigate. That, finally, is where Resident Evil 0 picks up, and we'll be talking about the events of that game in full detail in the next part of this series. In part 1 of our multi-part recap of the Resident Evil series, we kicked things off with, well, let's just call it what it was, a lore dump. This is Resident Evil after all, which means there is an insane amount of important backstory to go into. Here in part 2, however, we're finally ready to move into the overarching story of Resident Evil proper, starting with Resident Evil 0, the first chronological game in the series. The year 1998. Resident Evil 0 takes place in the year 1998, with the Ecliptic Express, an Umbrella-owned train, coming under a mysterious attack by a swarm of leeches, and all of its crew and passengers being killed. To investigate a series of killings in the Arklay Mountains, RPD's STARS division dispatches Bravo Team, including Enrico Marini, the captain of Bravo Team, Forrest Speyer, Kenneth Sullivan, Richard Aiken, whose fates are revealed later, the pilot Kevin Dooley, along with Rebecca Chambers, a rookie 18-year-old medical officer who's ready to go out on her first STARS mission. And of course, our protagonist, for now. Rebecca Chambers comes across a haunted train, the Ecliptic Express. But of course, as you would imagine, Umbrella and Spencer are all too aware of the trouble that Bravo Team's investigation into the Ecliptic Express could bring, and so they turn to Albert Wesker, their mole in the RPD and the captain of STARS. Albert Wesker's motivations. His mission is manifold: to lead the STARS officers astray in their investigations and sacrifice them to Umbrella's BOWs, to gather combat data from STARS' forthcoming encounters with said BOWs, and finally, to destroy Umbrella Corporation's secret lab underneath Spencer Mansion and destroy all of the evidence of their shady machinations. Things with Albert Wesker, however, are rarely, if ever, straightforward. And as it turns out, he has designs of his own at this point that don't necessarily align with Umbrella or Spencer's plans. By this point, Wesker has cleverly realized that Umbrella Corporation's less than legal and totally not moral actions are bound to come to light sooner rather than later, at which point the company is going to be in deep trouble. Wesker then wants to get out while he still can, and he just happens to have an out. Sometime prior to Resident Evil 0's events, Wesker has already been approached by a shadowy company rivaling Umbrella, an outfit known only as the Organization. They promise him protection and a new position, on one condition: he has to walk out with Umbrella's BOW embryos and deliver them. He even extends an offer to Birkin: come with him. Birkin turns it down, but it isn't loyalty talking. He refuses because he's married to his work, and because Nest, the subterranean lab beneath Raccoon City, is where he plans to stay and push the G virus to completion. We'll get into why that matters far more when we reach the events of Resident Evil 2. So Wesker's checklist hasn't really changed. Use STARS as expendable test subjects, secure the embryos, but the motivation has. He's no longer doing it as Umbrella's man. He's doing it as someone trying to buy his way out. The Haunted Eclipse Express. Resident Evil 0 kicks off with Bravo Team aboard a chopper and on their way to the Arklay Mountains, though things quickly go wrong as you might have expected. Thanks to Wesker, the helicopter's engine malfunctions, forcing it to crash land in the Arclay's forests, and soon, Rebecca Chambers finds herself separated from the group with Kevin Dooley dead. As she explores her surroundings to regroup with Bravo team, Rebecca comes across the abandoned Eclipse Express and quickly discovers, much to her horror, that its passengers and crew have been turned into zombies by the swarm of leeches that had attacked that train. Not everyone that Rebecca runs into on the Ecliptic Express has been zombified, however. One crucial figure she runs into is Billy Cohen, a former Marine who, after being wrongfully convicted of several murders, was being transported to Raccoon City, where he was supposed to be executed. Luckily for Billy, the transport vehicle crashed partway through the journey, following which he quickly found and hid in the Ecliptic. Soon afterwards, he runs into Rebecca. Not long afterward, Rebecca and Billy also notice a young man in the distance that neither of them are familiar with. Though incredible enough, the man somehow seems to be controlling the swarm of vicious leeches that attacked the train. Before they can investigate further, however, the duo is surprised to learn that the train has started to move again, and at speed. What they don't know is that the train is moving again thanks to two Umbrella Security Services, or USS agents, who were ordered by Wesker and William Birkin to destroy the Ecliptic Express, along with any evidence on board that could point to Umbrella's wrongdoing. The USS agents don't fare too well themselves either, however. Though they succeeded in starting the train back up, they're soon attacked and killed by mutant leeches, following which Rebecca and Billy are forced to stop the Ecliptic. With some difficulty, they manage to make their way to the front of the locomotive and get it to stop. When they disembark, they find themselves near an abandoned complex that, upon exploring it, they learn was a training facility for Umbrella, its executives, and its officers, and it was run by none other than Dr. James Marcus, one of Umbrella's co-founders and the creator of the T-Virus. The duo learn more about Umbrella's nefarious work and Marcus's role in it as they explore that facility. Meanwhile, at one point when Rebecca and Billy are separated, Rebecca also finally reunites with one of her fellow STARS members, Enrico Marini. Marini informs Rebecca that the surviving members of Bravo team are regrouping at a mansion nearby. And yes, he's talking about Spencer Mansion, where they plan to carry on with their mission. Rebecca decides to stay behind and look for Billy, after which Marini plans to find other STARS members at the Spencer Mansion. The Tyrant. For now, let's stick with Rebecca and Billy in the Umbrella facility, where things only continue to go from bad to worse, just to no one's surprise. For instance, the duo is forced to square off against a monstrosity unlike any other that they've ever seen, a strong humanoid known as the Tyrant, an Umbrella BOW that is fiercer, more durable, and more dangerous than any other that Umbrella has conjured up thus far. Somehow, Rebecca and Billy manage to escape with their lives, following which they resume their search of the leech-controlling man that they saw on the Ecliptic. The big revelation. Rebecca and Billy's search leads them to a water treatment plant where they finally learn the identity of the leech-controlling man. That man, as it turns out, is none other than Dr. James Marcus himself. But wait, you say, Marcus has been dead for years at this point. Well, he has, and he hasn't. A decade ago, Marcus was assassinated by Albert Wesker and William Birkin in the middle of an experiment involving a queen leech and the T-Virus. But shortly after his death, his body was taken over by the queen leech that he had been experimenting on. So in addition to reanimating him, the leech also got access to all of Marcus's memories, to the extent that the two effectively became all but assimilated into a single entity. Which, in simple terms, that the Queen Leech possessed decade-old corpse of Marcus believes itself to be the actual James Marcus. For the last decade, this mutated Marcus has been formulating his plan of vengeance against Umbrella and Spencer, which, as you may have guessed, also involved an attack on the Ecliptic Express, as well as an outbreak of the T-Virus. Rebecca and Billy face off against the zombified Queen Leech Marcus amalgamation as Resident Evil 0 approaches its close. And with great difficulty, the two manage to destroy the monstrosity. Inadvertently, they also trigger the facility's self-destruct sequence, something that Resident Evil fans almost take for granted from RE endings, but they manage to escape while the facility blows up in their wake. As the game comes to an end, Rebecca promises Billy that the report she files about this entire mess is going to confirm Billy as a casualty, which means the wrongfully convicted former Marine is essentially going to have his freedom back.
The two part ways, with Billy running off to places unknown, and to this day in fact, and Rebecca making her way to the Spencer Mansion, which of course is the setting for Resident Evil 1, the next game in the series chronology. And with that, we arrive at Resident Evil 1. We'll dive into the complete events of that game in the next chapter. While Resident Evil 0 focused on STARS' Bravo team investigating the Ecliptic Express, Resident Evil 1 revolves around Alpha Team, who are dispatched to the Arklay Mountains after RPD loses contact with Bravo. Composed of the Alpha Team are protagonist Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Brad Vickers, and Joseph Frost, and of course, the captain of STARS and the leader of Alpha Team himself, Albert Wesker.
Bizarre murder cases have recently occurred in Raccoon City. There are outlandish reports of families being attacked by a group of about 10 people. Victims were apparently eaten. The Bravo team was sent in to investigate, but we lost contact.
Look, Chris.
The horror at Arklay Mountains. Resident Evil 1 kicks off with the Alpha Team flying their chopper over the Arklay Mountains, where they spot Bravo Team's crashed chopper in the forest and decide to land and investigate. As is so often the case in Resident Evil games, however, things, unsurprisingly, quickly go south. Alpha Team is attacked by a pack of rabid, zombified dogs, more hellhounds than dogs, to be honest, and the aforementioned Joseph Frost is promptly killed. The pilot, Brad Vickers, panics instantly, jumps back into the chopper and takes off, abandoning the rest of his team in the forest and surrounded by vicious beasts hell-bent on tearing them apart. Their only option is to flee on foot, and soon they find unlikely refuge in an abandoned mansion nearby. No prizes for guessing, it is the Spencer Mansion. But though Alpha Team has managed to escape the zombie dogs in the forest, the insides of the mansion aren't faring much better. Thanks to an earlier attack by James Marks' Queen Leech, the T-Virus has broken out in the Spencer Mansion, which means it's now effectively a labyrinthine death trap full of mazes, traps, and of course, zombies and other terrifying bioweapons. Including among those is Lisa Trevor, whose decayed remains have also been reanimated by the T-Virus. Following which, she once again roams the halls of Spencer Mansion, prolonging her endless torture yet again. Alpha Team is forced to square off against all of this and more as they explore Spencer Mansion in an effort to not only uncover its secrets and the secrets of Umbrella, but also find a way out alive and make it back to Raccoon City. Inside the mansion, the search stops feeling like an investigation, and it starts to feel like a slow-motion ambush.
Jill, don't scare me.
Speak for yourself, Barry. What are you doing here?
Yeah. Well, I think you should take a look at this. I warn you, though, it's not pretty. It's forest.
The massacre inside the mansion. While in the mansion, Chris and Jill also come across members of Bravo Team, though not in the state that they would hope to find them. Most have either died or become zombified, though one who is clinging to life still is Enrico Marini, Bravo Team's captain. You're finding Bravo Team in fragments. Kenneth's tape is the kind of discovery that instantly tells you this wasn't a crash and a bad night. He was literally eaten by a zombie. Then comes the moments that pin the horror in place. Not just shambling corpses, but the kind of umbrella horror that makes your stomach drop, like running into Richard Aiken and how he sacrifices his life for others. And for a Speyer, if you know, you know. As Chris and Jill push deeper, the mansion keeps pulling masks off itself. Yawn isn't just a mere animal. There are many times where this infection stops looking like an outbreak and starts looking like an experiment, with Plant 42 blooming like a weapon that learned how to hate. Barry's dilemma. Barry stays close to Jill, guiding her through the mansion's worst choke points and showing up at just the right time when exactly she needs. For a while, it reads like simple teamwork under pressure, until the pattern starts to feel wrong. Because behind the scenes, Barry isn't acting on instinct. Wesker has him on a leash. Wesker, secretly Umbrella's inside man, corners Barry with the one kind of threat that actually works on him: his family. And once that pressure is on, Barry becomes a quiet accomplice in the mansion's cover-up, wiping away loose ends, steering Jill away from the wrong discoveries, and nudging her towards danger when Wesker needs a test subject instead of a survivor. Either Chris or Jill, depending on who you choose to play as, run into Marini, who informs them that one of Alpha Team's members is a traitor and loyal to Umbrella. Before he can reveal the traitor's identity, though, Marini is shot and killed by an unseen attacker.
Umbrella set us up.
Enrico! Traitor? Who?
Rebecca Chambers, Bravo Team's young medic, is also still alive, separated from her squad after the crash and forced to survive around the Spencer estate. In Chris's story especially, she isn't just a cameo. She becomes a rare lifeline inside of the mansion, and at one point she's found desperately trying to treat a critically wounded Richard Aiken, pushing Chris to find serum before it's too late. The truth revealed. Slowly but surely, as Chris and Jill explore the mansion, they begin to put the pieces together about Spencer Mansion and the lab underneath, Umbrella's activities, and its work with BOWs, including the T-virus. Later, they find themselves in the lab itself, where Jill or Chris, whichever one you're not playing as, is being kept captive in a cage by Albert Wesker, who reveals himself as the traitor to surviving STARS members and involved with Umbrella stuff. Barry intervenes, reveals the truth, but Wesker forces him into humiliation, raising his gun on the player to prove who's really in control. But it doesn't hold. The moment Wesker lets himself gloat and admits the family threat was never as solid as Barry feared, the spell breaks. Barry snaps back to himself, turns the gun the only way he can without killing anyone, and drops Wesker with a brutal, desperate strike, choosing the player, choosing his team, and finally refusing to be used. Hoping to get rid of STARS once and for all, Wesker releases a tyrant that he hopes will attack and kill STARS. The first person the tyrant attacks, however, is Wesker himself, stabbing him through the chest and seemingly killing him. But not really, as you may have guessed, and more on that later. Unbeknownst to Chris and Jill, long before any of this spirals out of control, Wesker secretly injects himself with a modified viral strain, an insurance policy that doesn't matter at the moment but will cast a long shadow over everything that follows. Chris or Jill then take on the tyrant, and after a desperate struggle are able to defeat the bioweapon, following which they trigger the lab's self-destruct sequence. Resident Evil 1's canon ending, or the good ending, sees Chris, Jill, Rebecca, and Barry Burton successfully escaping Spencer Mansion aboard a chopper piloted by the returning Brad Vickers, while the mansion and everything inside is blown sky high. And that's where Resident Evil 1 ends. When we return for part 4 of our Resident Evil recap, we'll be headed to Raccoon City, where things will continue to go monumentally wrong. So fun times ahead.
In part 3 of our full Resident Evil recap, we discussed the events of Resident Evil 1, the second chronological game in the franchise. Here in part 4, we're going to move our focus to Resident Evil 2, specifically its 2018 remake, which finally brings us to the iconic Raccoon City, where things really start going wrong on a much, much larger scale than anything that has come before. The destruction of Raccoon City. Raccoon City is where the ugly consequences of Umbrella's experiments with bioweapons and deadly viruses rears their head. But before we can get to that, it is important to go over some important events related specifically to the Umbrella scientist William Birkin, the creator of the G-Virus, whose hubris turns out to be the downfall of all of Raccoon City. After assassinating James Marcus along with Albert Wesker, stealing the Umbrella co-founder's work and taking all of the credit for it, Birkin, along with his wife, another scientist named Annette Birkin, was put in charge of an elaborate underground lab called NEST by Oswell Spencer. Located right underneath Raccoon City, NEST was the recipient of heavy investments by Umbrella, using which William Birkin and his team created and continued to work on the G-Virus. As time went on, however, Birkin realized that Umbrella wasn't going to allow him to grow within the company, and unsurprisingly, not long afterward, he made the decision to betray Umbrella. Birkin contacted the United States military and made a deal to sell them G-Virus for a large sum of money, which the military was all too happy to agree to, given the massive destructive potential of G-Virus as a bioweapon. Shortly before Resident Evil 2's events kick off, Umbrella gets to know of Birkin's plans and starts taking steps of its own. The company sends a USS squad led by an operative known as Hunk to Nest, with their mission being to bring Birkin in alive and confiscate all of his work on the G-Virus. In the struggle that follows, however, Birkin is shot and left for dead, and the USS squad leaves with samples of the G-Virus in a case which incidentally also had the T-Virus. Birkin, however, isn't dead yet. This is going to be something of a running theme here. And after the squad departs, he injects himself with G-Virus to give chase to the USS squad in the sewers. His wife steps in to shoot him, but decides not to. Birkin now hunts the squad and kills them all. However, in the tussle, one of the soldiers drops samples of the T-Virus. It shatters on the ground in the sewers beneath Raccoon City, only to then be consumed by rats, which, as you may have guessed, is how the T-Virus outbreak in the city begins. It must be noted that the 4th Survivor DLC makes it clear that Hunk survived the incident, escaped with the G-Virus sample, and handed it over to Umbrella's European side. Leon and Claire enter the scene. Now, this is where we shift focus to the events of Resident Evil 2 itself, 2 months after the events of Resident Evil 1, and to our new protagonists, Leon S. Kennedy, a rookie cop who is going in for his first day on the job at RPD, and Claire Redfield, who's traveled to Raccoon City to find her brother Chris, whom she hasn't heard from in a while. As RE2 kicks off, Leon's and Claire's paths quickly collide. They happen to run into each other at a gas station on the outskirts of Raccoon City, which they find is overrun by zombies. Overwhelmed and surrounded by the undead, the two quickly decide to help each other and jump into Leon's car and drive into the city proper, where things could not be worse. The T-Virus outbreak has resulted in a large portion of the city's population turning into zombies, while many others have become fodder for those who have freshly turned. In short, it is all chaos. Madness awaits. That chaos results in Leon and Claire promptly being separated from one another, following which the two decide to head to the RPD building, not only to meet back up with each other, but to get on with their individual missions. For Leon, that is reporting for duty and helping out in any way that he can. And for Claire, it's figuring out where Chris is. Upon reaching the police building, which in true Resident Evil fashion once used to be a museum before being repurposed as RPD's HQ, Leon and Claire realize that things are not much better here either. Though the RPD building had been a last refuge for the Raccoon City's survivors for a while, by the time our heroes get there, things have gone spectacularly wrong, once again. Almost everyone has died, their bodies and pools of blood everywhere, and of course there's no shortage of zombies either. The only source of help they find in the building is Marvin Branagh, a police officer who himself has sustained a zombie bite, which he eventually succumbs to after spending a good chunk of the game helping Leon and Claire find a way out of the maze-like RPD building. Mr. X is gonna get you. For Leon, our hero is now going to face some terrifying roadblocks, not only in the form of zombies, zombie dogs, and nightmarish creatures known as lickers, but also a tyrant, known to Resident Evil fans as Mr. X, sent by Umbrella to ensure that there are no survivors in Raccoon City who can spill the beans on the company's wrongdoings and its role in this outbreak. Not long after Leon's arrival at RPD, he meets Ben Bertolucci, an investigative journalist who's been locked up in a cell. He tells Leon that he's investigating allegations of corruption within the police department, but unluckily for him, this is where Mr. X enters the picture. Before he can reveal any actual details, Ben is murdered by the tyrant, who crashes through the wall of his cell and crushes his skull with its bare hands. From that point onward, Mr. X pursues Leon through RPD doggedly. We'll get back to his story in a bit, but for now, let's switch over to Claire. Sherry Birkin. Claire has also been roaming the halls of RPD and dealing with its many horrors in search of her brother Chris, and eventually she discovers information as to his whereabouts. Paperwork in the STARS office reveals that Chris left Raccoon City weeks ago, and that he is currently investigating Umbrella somewhere in Europe. That, of course, means that Claire's primary goal now is to find a way out of the RPD building and then escape Raccoon City. Not long afterward, however, Claire crosses paths with Sherry, a young, scared girl wearing a curious pendant who also happens to be the daughter of William and Annette Birkin. That, of course, isn't known to Claire, who quickly agrees to help Sherry look for her parents and make sure that she doesn't succumb to the many horrors of Raccoon City. Her first meeting with Sherry, however, also sees Claire being attacked by a hideous, mutated monstrosity that is unlike any other BOW that she or Leon have come across yet. That monstrosity is none other than William Birkin himself, infected by the G-Virus and going through several horrific evolutions. Claire manages to hold Birkin at bay, but only for now. But don't worry, he'll be back. Several times. That said, it's not long before Claire has to deal with an entirely different kind of monster. As she and Sherry are about to find a way out of RPD, they cross paths with Brian Irons, the chief of RPD, and unfortunately for our heroes, a serial killer and a deeply corrupt cop, to say the least. You see, Brian has been on Umbrella's payroll for years and has been using his position to cover up the company's work, even having helped with the construction of Nest right underneath Raccoon City. Oh, and by the way, he also killed Catherine Warren, the daughter of Raccoon City's mayor, Michael Warren. When the T-Virus outbreak engulfed Raccoon City, the mayor fled, and she was placed in custody of Irons, who intended to murder and preserve her corpse. Realizing his plan, she ran, but he ultimately killed her. And at this very moment, he has his eyes on Sherry. Irons attacks Claire, who is unable to stop him from grabbing Sherry and leaving. In the struggle, however, Sherry also happens to drop her pendant, which, as it turns out, is exactly what Irons was after. That pendant, you see, happens to be the key to Nest, the orphanage. Shortly afterward, Irons contacts Claire and tells her that if she wants to see Sherry alive, she will have to bring that pendant to him, and tells her to meet him at an orphanage not far from the RPD building. So Claire heads off. But before we talk about the orphanage and everything that happens there, let's go ahead and switch back to Leon. Because Leon too crosses paths with a rather interesting personality. After witnessing Ben's death, he meets Ada Wong, a woman who claims to be an FBI agent who is on the hunt for incriminating samples of the G-Virus as part of a government investigation into Umbrella. Leon agrees to help get her hands on G, a decision he makes after witnessing a gun shop owner named Robert Kendo having to put down his infected daughter before taking his own life. Together, Leon and Ada descend into the sewers of Raccoon City looking for a way into Nest. G-mutated creatures and monstrosities will block their path, including a massive mutated alligator among several other things. Well, this is also where they run into Annette Birkin. Unlike Leon, she knows what Ada's true motivations are, and more on that in just a bit. And in a desperate attempt to stop them in their tracks, she attacks them and shoots Leon. With Ada's help, however, Leon is able to recover and the two continue their journey, eventually finding a way into Nest. Meanwhile, Claire makes her way through the hellish streets of Raccoon City and reaches the orphanage, which has a dark and twisted backstory if there has ever been one. Founded and built by Umbrella, the orphanage has been little more than a front to quietly abduct children and use them as test subjects for the company's experiments. After Sherry injures Irons during a struggle, he turns the tables and begins to hunt her. However, their encounter is interrupted by the abrupt arrival of the G-Virus infected William Birkin. Not only does Birkin attack Irons, he also infects Sherry with the G-Virus, believing that, like him, she will be a suitable host for G. Claire finds Sherry and squares off against Chief Irons, only to find him exploded. Knowing that the only way she can save Sherry is with a vaccine, Claire grabs the little girl and also heads to Nest. The revelations in the Nest. With both our protagonists and all major players now finding themselves in Nest, as you may imagine, this is where Resident Evil 2's story comes to a head. Leon gets hold of the G-Virus, but he locks horns with Annette Birkin, who reveals Ada's true intentions. Annette tells Leon she's not an FBI agent at all, but rather a rogue mercenary who intends to sell G to the highest bidder. What isn't revealed here is that she was sent to Raccoon City to steal a G sample by none other than Albert Wesker himself, but we'll talk about that more later on down the road. Claire, meanwhile, is able to brave the horrors of Nest and retrieve a vaccine, which she is then able to save Sherry's life. There are, however, other hurdles to deal with, as you may have guessed. William Birkin arrives on the scene at this point, and by now he's been mutated by G beyond all recognition. And in the chaos that ensues, he kills Annette, while Nest's self-destruct sequence is also activated. With the lab falling to pieces, Ada, with a sample of G on her, falls into a gaping abyss, seemingly to her death. Leon, meanwhile, has one final encounter with Mr. X, who himself has mutated and transformed into an even stronger version of the Tyrant bioweapon, though with the help from an unseen person, and read Ada, who drops down a rocket launcher for him to use, Leon is able to finally take the monster down once and for all. Leon, Claire, and Sherry are able to escape the lab's destruction by boarding a train that speeds away through an underground tunnel, but not before one final encounter with William Birkin, yes, again, who has mutated further still. Thankfully, this fight ends with his death, and for real this time, following which Leon, Claire, and Sherry finally make it out of Raccoon City, bringing their night of terrors to an end. Both Leon and Claire are, however, now determined to put a stop to Umbrella's machinations. RE2's events directly set up Resident Evil Code Veronica, but before we get to that, we're going to need to spend some more time in Raccoon City, where there's still plenty to get to. So when we return in Part 5, we'll talk about the events of Resident Evil Outbreak, and then further parts cover Outbreak File number 2, following which we'll be turning our attention to Resident Evil 3, or more specifically, its 2020 remake. Part 4 of our Resident Evil recap finally took us to Raccoon City, where we went over the events of Resident Evil 2 and Leon S. Kennedy and Claire Redfield's Night of Terrors. There are, however, still plenty of stories left to tell in Raccoon City, even before we get to Resident Evil 3 in fact. So here in Part 4, we're going to talk about Resident Evil Outbreak, which along with its sequel has been a canonical but relatively less important part of the overarching Resident Evil narrative. Now though, with the upcoming Resident Evil Requiem confirmed to have several direct ties to the Outbreak games, both have increased rapidly in significance. The outbreak of course happened because of USS's scuffle with a G-infected William Birkin in the sewers beneath the city, as we covered in Part 4, which ended with rats in the sewer feasting on a broken T-virus vial and later infecting the city's water supply. The setting. Resident Evil Outbreak begins a couple of days after the T-virus has started to break out in Raccoon City. But before we get to that, let's pause and talk about our 8 main characters, each of whom is playable. At this point, it seems fair to say that the most important of the Outbreak cast to RE lore in general is Alyssa Ashcroft, given the fact that her daughter's one of the upcoming Resident Evil Requiem's 2 main protagonists. But there's a lot to get into with her backstory, so we'll save her for last. Let's talk about the other 7 first. There's Cindy Lennox, a waitress at the Raccoon City outlet, who also happens to have some basic first aid knowledge, which, as you can imagine, will come in particularly handy in the middle of a city-wide zombie outbreak. Then there's Jim Chapman, a Subway employee, an expert at puzzles, and frankly, a little bit of a coward. There's David King, a plumber who's had a rough childhood and now fancies himself something of a survivalist. There's George Hamilton, a specialist surgeon who works at Raccoon General Hospital and is considered to be among the best in the field. There's Mark Wilkins, a former U.S. Army vet who now works as a private security guard. We also have Kevin Ryman, an RPD officer who, interestingly enough, has 2 unsuccessful applications to join STARS under his belt. Then we have Yoko Suzuki, who also happens to have strong ties to RE lore, compared to the many others in this cast at least. As a child, she became involved in experiments conducted by Umbrella Corporation, during which time she was even infected by the T-virus at one point, which conveniently for her, later gave her stronger resistance to the virus than most. Yoko's experiences with Umbrella as a child were so traumatic for her, however, that she had her memories of the time repressed by Greg Mueller, an experimental Umbrella researcher and scientist. Afterwards, however, she continued to work at Umbrella. In fact, she worked at Nest under William Birkin himself and would gain knowledge of a lot of Umbrella's secret bioweapons projects, including the Tyrant. Alyssa Ashcroft. Then we finally come to Alyssa Ashcroft, an investigative journalist who, by the time Resident Evil Outbreak kicks off in September 1998, had been working in her field, and quite successfully so at that, for about 5 years. It has not, however, been an easy road. At the beginning of her career in 1993, she was involved in a story about a private hospital in the Arklay Mountains, where some illegal tests were allegedly being conducted. That hospital and the tests, as you may have guessed, were funded and backed by Umbrella Corporation. Alyssa investigated this story with Kurt, a fellow investigative journalist, who chooses to infiltrate the hospital as a patient to attain some information. That, however, tragically ended with Kurt being killed by a zombified patient, who interestingly happened to be the hospital director's wife, but that's a different story. Following the incident, Alyssa's memories were suppressed, possibly through the same procedure that Yoko Suzuki had Umbrella researcher Greg Mueller use on her. Alyssa continued to work as an investigative researcher in the aftermath, and a lot of her stories would continue to revolve around Umbrella and investigations into the company's shady, well, just to put it mildly, practices, including the company's ties to Raccoon Zoo, Raccoon University, and more. The Outbreak. And now that we've gone through all 8 of Resident Evil Outbreak's 8 main characters, we can move on to the game's story, which begins with all 8 characters, the establishment where Cindy Lennox works as a waitress. And it doesn't take long for things to completely spiral out of control. Right at the outset of the game, they are attacked by a horde of zombies, with the cook, Will, being killed, but only after he manages to seal it off, preventing the zombies from breaking in. The group flees to the establishment's roof, but Bob, a friend of Mark Wilkins and an employee of his private security firm, also begins feeling the effects of a zombie bite, following which he shoots himself before he can turn. Although he, like a lot of characters in Resident Evil Outbreak, has multiple possible endings. If you're playing on harder difficulty, for instance, he is killed by zombies before he can shoot himself or even turn. On the roof, the group hears an announcement by the RPD about an impending evacuation of the area, which goes with the warning that if citizens cannot get to their nearest allotted checkpoints in time, their safety is by no means going to be guaranteed with what's coming next. Desperate to escape, the group jumps across the rooftop to an apartment building nearby, before exiting onto the chaotic city streets where they continue to move forward. The group soon crosses paths with Rayman Douglas, who is serving as RPD's acting chief through the early outbreak, and at present is organizing an effort to block the street with a barricade made of police cars in order to stem the flow of zombies. The group of survivors decide to help Douglas, but the undead keep pouring in at a startling rate, and it's not long before they're overwhelmed. In the ensuing chaos, Douglas is bit by zombies, but before he can die, he informs the group that there is a large gas tanker nearby, which, if exploded, will help eliminate the horde of zombies, though it will, of course, also cause massive destruction in the area. The survivors succeed in blowing up the tanker, killing a large number of zombies in the process, following which they escape through a nearby canal and into the city's sewers. When they emerge back out again, they find themselves in front of the Apple Inn, where things aren't much better, predictably enough. Here they meet Dorian, an RPD officer who, along with fellow cops and demolition experts, leads our protagonist to the location Main Street, close to Raccoon Mall. Main Street, incidentally, also happens to be the scene for an ongoing police operation, destroying the street with explosives to kill a horde of zombies, which the group of survivors ends up helping with. The operation is ultimately successful, and even though there are some casualties, Main Street is successfully blown up. The horde of undead is dealt a massive blow, and our heroes are able to escape safely. That is all the first of Resident Evil Outbreak's 5 scenarios. At this point, the group of survivors splits up, and the following 4 scenarios, told in non-chronological order, each focuses on different characters, while you can, of course, also always choose which of the 8 characters you want to play as. Of the remaining 4 scenarios, the one that is chronologically closest to the game's beginning events, which we just covered, is Hellfire, which takes us back to Apple Inn, which has probably never been in worse shape. Amidst the outbreak, the hotel has caught on fire, with large sections of the building being ravaged by flames. All of that has only been made worse, in fact, by the explosion of a nearby gas tanker, which, as we know, was caused by our protagonists. Hellfire. The Raccoon Fire Department, which is already overworked with fires sweeping the entire city as it is dispatched to the Apple Inn, where unfortunately for everyone involved, even more chaos awaits. That chaos comes in the form of yet another explosion caused by the issues in our hotel's boiler room, following which more flames engulf the building. The Hellfire scenario sees our heroes trapped in Apple Inn and trying to find a way out, while having to deal with the undead, terrifying monstrosities such as lickers, and of course, flames aplenty. Their final challenge comes in the form of a creature known as Suspended, which is a nightmarish cross between a zombie and a licker that hasn't yet fully transformed into its final disgusting form. After successfully dealing with Suspended, our protagonists are able to escape the inn and arrive on the streets of Raccoon City. The Hive. Another one of Outbreak's 5 scenarios is The Hive, which, unlike the Apple Inn in Hellfire, takes players to a location the series' fans will be very familiar with, the Raccoon General Hospital, which serves as the setting for a good chunk of Resident Evil 3. The Hive sees our main survivors trying to find a way out of the hospital, which, in addition to the undead, is also being haunted by a monstrosity known as the Leech Man. Back before the outbreak, this was Dr. Hirsch, who worked at Raccoon General, though at the beginning of the Hive, at which point he has already been bitten by a zombie, is attacked by mutated leeches, who take control of him to assume a humanoid shape and become the aforementioned Leech Man. The survivors are ultimately able to kill the Leech Man, following which they escape into an underground exit, where they also encounter and fight another massive hive of leeches and a creature known as Queen Leech. Below freezing point. Another Resident Evil Outbreak scenario that takes players to a familiar Raccoon location is Below Freezing Point, which is set in Nest, the underground Umbrella lab beneath the city that is run by Dr. William Birkin. In this scenario, as you may have imagined, Yoko Suzuki plays a crucial role, as does a woman named Monica, a fellow researcher who worked at Nest with her. The survivors face many horrors throughout their time in Nest, predictably enough, with Monica, who happens to have a vial of the G-Virus with her, is also a constant nuisance. Monica's death comes through G itself. In fact, when a G larva bursts through her body and kills her as she infects herself with the virus. Throughout this scenario, Yoko Suzuki's memories, previously repressed by Greg Mueller, also return to her in bits and pieces, while she also has to come to terms with not only the disastrous work that Umbrella has been doing and the consequences that are emerging as a result, but also with her own role in that work. Towards the end of the scenario, as a way of trying to make amends and to cut herself off completely from her past life, before escaping Nest with the other survivors, Yoko also assists with the activation of the lab's self-destruct system. The Outbreak survivors do make it into Nest during the Raccoon City disaster, but their trip there likely happens earlier, before RE2's late-game self-destruct and escape sequence. Decisions. And now we come to Resident Evil Outbreak's fifth and final scenario, titled Decisions, which begins with Greg Hamilton, one of our 8 protagonists, receiving a letter from a friend of his who works at Raccoon University and is asking for his assistance on something that clearly seems important. Leading a group of a handful of survivors, Greg heads to the university, which, as you may have guessed, serves as the setting for this scenario. And though they arrive to find Greg's friend already dead through a gunshot wound to the head, they also discover that he's been working on an antivirus called Daylight, which has the ability to counteract the T-virus. This scenario then sees our heroes trying to generate the antivirus before they can then escape. On their harrowing mission through the university, the survivors not only deal with bioweapons such as zombies, hunter gammas, and a tyrant known as Thanatos, created by none other than Greg Mueller, but also with a group of mercenaries working for the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, or the UBCS, which also includes one Nikolai Zinovev, who we'll be talking about much more when we get to Resident Evil 3. Their mission? To find and kill Greg Mueller, who is at the university, has gone rogue and defected from Umbrella, and, as it turns out, was also instrumental in the creation of the Daylight antivirus. As this scenario comes to a close, however, the survivors are able to successfully synthesize the anti-vaccine, following which they take on Thanatos in one final battle, and then climb aboard an evacuation chopper that flies them out of Raccoon City while it gets nuked to hell behind them. And again, more on that when we get to Resident Evil 3. And that's it. That's all of Resident Evil Outbreak. When we return in Part 6, we'll talk about its sequel, Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2, which continues to tell stories revolving around the same 8 characters across its own set of scenarios. In Part 5 of our Resident Evil recap, we covered the events of Resident Evil Outbreak, which sees 8 different survivors attempting to survive the T-virus outbreak in Raccoon City and trying to make it out alive. Here in Part 6, we're going to move on to its sequel, Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2, which tells more episodic, non-chronological stories across 5 different scenarios, focusing on the same 8 central characters: investigative journalist Alyssa Ashcroft, former Umbrella researcher Yoko Suzuki, specialist surgeon George Hamilton, RPD officer Kevin Ryman, private security executive Mark Wilkins, delinquent and plumber David King, waitress Cindy Lennox, and Kite Bros Railway employee Jim Chapman. Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2 begins not long after the T-Virus outbreak begins in Raccoon City, same as the first outbreak. But at this point, the city is already engulfed in chaos, to the extent that the National Guard has now moved in and has put Raccoon City under quarantine. The public message is that the city has suffered a radiation spill, a cover story drummed up by the United States government so that its own history of working with Umbrella and not only allowing, but even encouraging development of bioweapons does not come to light. That, of course, means that there's no way in or out of the city, leaving our central group of protagonists with fewer chances of escape and slimming odds of survival. In spite of that, however, Cindy Lennox leads a group of survivors that she leads to Raccoon Zoo in Outbreak File Number 2's first scenario. Why? Wild things. You see, in the early hours of the outbreak before his brutal death, which we talked about in our RE Outbreak recap, acting RPD Chief Raymond Douglas has informed the city's population that every 4 hours, helicopters will be taking off from specific evacuation zones, carrying out groups of people one by one. Hoping that the evacuation plans are still in effect, Cindy and a group of survivors travel to Raccoon Zoo in hopes of getting to a tram that will then carry them to the evacuation zone in that part of the city. And Raccoon Zoo ends up being quite a nightmare. Well, because as you might have guessed, it is crawling with all manner of zombified and mutated animals, including an infected lion, and even a zombified elephant named Oscar that pursues them throughout the scenario. Ultimately, the group successfully makes it through the zoo and takes the tram to the evacuation site, though it all turns out to be for nothing. As it turns out, the evacuation chopper suffered an accident of its own while it was taking off, leading to a prompt crash that killed everyone who was aboard, including a significant number of survivors and even the pilot. Responding to the disaster, the National Guard takes drastic measures and cancels all further evacuation efforts. So yeah, that isn't exactly a happy ending for Outbreak File Number 2's first scenario. Underbelly. Predictably, things don't get much better in the game's second scenario, titled Underbelly, which sees another group of survivors led by Jim Chapman braving Raccoon City's subway system after fleeing from a horde of the undead. While in the station, the group realizes that they can also use a train to escape the city. This scenario sees players having to explore the subway system as they try to find a way to get one of the trains in working order. That, of course, comes with various obstacles, from zombies, surprise, surprise, to a freak train crash and more. Their biggest challenge, in fact, comes in the form of terrifying massive fleas. Yes, fleas that have been mutated by the T-Virus. Ultimately, the group is able to deal with all of the obstacles that are thrown in its way and ride the train to a safe distance. But not safe enough, unfortunately. Blockages on the track force the train to stop close to the Arklay Mountains, leaving the survivors to continue their perilous journey on foot. Flashback. Now we come to Alyssa Ashcroft, who is central to the story told in Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2's third scenario called Flashback. The episode begins with our group of survivors chancing upon an old cabin in the woods owned by a man named Albert Lester, who goes by Al. And if that name sounds familiar, it should, but we're going to get to that in a bit. Al greets the group and gives them some much-needed good news. He says he knows a way out of Raccoon City and can lead them to a neighboring town. Led by Al, the group arrives at a suspension bridge, though things quickly take a weird turn. Al mysteriously disappears. After failing to locate him, the group crosses the bridge, arriving at an abandoned hospital building. They decide to enter the building and see if there's anything in there that they can use to their advantage, though to no one's surprise, that turns out to be a bad decision. In the hospital, our heroes are forced to brave all manner of nightmares, including not only a terrifying masked man who wields an axe and pursues them throughout the hospital, and is revealed to be none other than Al, but also a gigantic, heavily mutated plant that is overgrown beyond all reason and taken over large sections of the building. The group spends much of the scenario traversing the hospital and killing pieces of the plant, while Alyssa also continues to learn crucial details about her own past. As we talked about in our recap of the original Outbreak, at the outset of her career as an investigative journalist, Alyssa was involved in the investigation of a hospital in the Arklay Mountains that was allegedly running illegal experiments on its patients, and was of course secretly funded by Umbrella. Alyssa was working on the story with a man named Kurt, who infiltrated the facility as a patient in order to uncover information, only to then be killed by a zombified patient named Dorothy. In the aftermath, Alyssa lost her memories of the whole ordeal, possibly thanks to Umbrella itself. But throughout this scenario of Outbreak File Number 2, she pieces the whole thing back together again. The scenario culminates in a boss battle against the mutated plant's core, which, once defeated, reveals what is really at its actual core: Albert Lester's dead wife, Dorothy Lester. And yes, that's the same Dorothy. So what exactly is going on here? Well, you see, years ago, Al was the director of this very hospital where our heroes now find themselves. His wife, Dorothy, had terminal cancer, and in a desperate bid to save her life, Al entered into a less than legal and more than shady agreement with Umbrella researcher Greg Mueller, who we talked about quite a bit in our Outbreak Number 1 recap. This agreement involved Umbrella being allowed to run secret and illegal experiments on patients, while in exchange, the company would perform an experimental treatment on Dorothy that may or may not deal with her cancer. You know, in spoilers, it doesn't. Dorothy was zombified and would later go on to kill Alyssa Ashcroft's investigative partner, Kurt. Later, Dorothy died herself and the hospital would shut down. While Al suffered something of a mental break, he then made a habit of returning to the abandoned hospital where, in his splintered mental state, he started caring for and nourishing a mutated plant that he believed to be his wife. He placed her body at the plant's core and would often lead people to the hospital to then feed that plant. In the here and now, though, with the plant dead and Dorothy's preserved but very dead remains in front of him, Al snaps back to reality. As the hospital begins crashing down to the ground, Al cradles Dorothy's corpse in his arms, only to be killed by falling debris. Our group of survivors, meanwhile, is able to escape the hospital in time. And that's it for the third scenario, which then brings us to the fourth one. Desperate Times. This scenario takes players to an iconic and fan-favorite Raccoon City location in the RPD building. Players work with none other than Lieutenant Marvin Branagh, who had a solid role to play in Resident Evil 2, with whose help the survivors try to find a way out of the station, which has been closed off by a horde of zombies right outside of the entrance. They succeed in opening up a secret passageway through which they send a cop named Rita, following which it's up to them to survive against the incoming onslaught of zombies long enough for Rita to arrive with help. Eventually, she does arrive in the nick of time with another cop in a van, with which the survivors climb into and make a tight escape. Unfortunately, Branagh, who has sustained injuries, decides to stay behind in the RPD, which is exactly where Leon and Claire find him in Resident Evil 2 down the road. And now we come to the final scenario of Resident Evil Outbreak Number 2, titled End of the Road. The scenario sees a group of survivors led by David King heading to an Umbrella facility where some significant events are taking place. Central to the story here is Linda Baldwin, an Umbrella researcher who, after growing disillusioned with the company and its activities, has gone rogue and started taking steps to work against the company. That comes in the form of an experimental antiviral drug that could help prevent a global T-virus outbreak, which Linda has come looking for in the Umbrella facility. Waiting for her outside is a man named Captain Rodriguez, a rogue USS operative who is ready to take off in a helicopter and leave Raccoon City in his rearview mirror. Rodriguez is waiting for Linda to make it back with whatever it is that she's looking for, with him not being aware of the antiviral agent, but has also made it perfectly clear to her that he isn't going to wait very long. Interestingly enough, he's also carrying an experimental bioweapon aboard the chopper, but we're going to get to that a little bit later. Our heroes encounter Linda not long after arriving at the facility, and then take on a variety of creatures and monstrosities as they make their way forward, from hunters to a tyrant and more. Linda is eventually separated from the group and falls down sewage systems in a water treatment plant, which leads her right into the heart of Raccoon City, in front of Apple Inn, in fact, which was an important location in the first Outbreak game. This scenario of Outbreak File Number 2 is heavily driven by player choice, which impacts the fate of certain characters and how the episode ends. For instance, it's up to the players to decide if they wish to head back into the city and find and rescue a heavily injured Linda. And if you do, whether or not you're able to make it back to the helicopter in time can also change things quite a bit. Ultimately, players can either successfully escape the city aboard the chopper, or you have to find your own way out while the chopper gets shot down by the army. That then, however, also releases the bioweapon that it was carrying, a horrifying experimental amalgamation of zombies, a tyrant, and who really knows what else. As you would expect, our heroes have to fight and defeat Nyx, following which they escape Raccoon City in a truck while the city is nuked behind them, which we're going to get to down the road. And that's all of Resident Evil Outbreak number 2. And given how player choice driven this game is, there's not much set in stone in terms of what becomes of its main characters, or how many of them even survive. One that we definitely know survives is Alyssa Ashcroft, who is not only the journalist looking into the Baker family's freaky activities prior to the events of Resident Evil 7, but is also going to have a role to play in the upcoming Resident Evil Requiem. Through Requiem's trailers, we know that Alyssa was murdered in Wynwood Hotel several years before the game's events, and that her daughter, FBI technical specialist Grace Ashcroft, is one of the game's 2 central protagonists. Anyway, that is all for our recap of Resident Evil Outbreak File Number 2. When we return for Part 7 of our recap of the Resident Evil series, we'll be covering the events of Resident Evil 3 Remake. Here we are, Part 7 of our Resident Evil recap. We spent the last few parts of this series talking about events in Raccoon City, and now, or after having covered the events of Resident Evil 2 and both Outbreak games, here we're going to wrap up the Raccoon City storyline, well, for the time being, with Resident Evil 3. Like with our Resident Evil 1 and 2 recaps, do keep in mind that this recap is going to be focusing on Resident Evil 3's remake and not the original title. So with that out of the way, let's get started. Resident Evil 3's story is set across several days, beginning slightly before the events of Resident Evil 2, then running concurrently to it for a good chunk, and then following up on it to reveal Raccoon City's ultimate fate. Meanwhile, once again, the game also shifts focus to a different protagonist, and once again, shining the spotlight on STARS member Jill Valentine, who is Resident Evil 1's co-protagonist with Chris Redfield. Horrors at the apartment. Resident Evil 3 begins with Jill in her apartment, where in the aftermath of the Spencer Mansion incident a handful of months prior, she had been conducting her own investigation into Umbrella Corporation. The ordeal that she went through in the mansion, however, has obviously affected her in several ways, with traumatic memories and nightmares still very much haunting her. Things, however, are only going to get worse for her. So much worse. Jill is awoken by a phone call in the middle of the night, and when she answers, it's fellow STARS member and the group's pilot, Brad Vickers, on the other end, frantically telling her to get out of her apartment and run. Their conversation is cut short, however, because Jill instantly discovers why Brad wants her to flee. Her apartment is broken into, which is a mild way of putting it, by a hulking monstrosity that seems to have one goal in mind: killing Jill. This monstrosity in question is none other than Nemesis, an experimental and highly dangerous tyrant prototype that has been created by Umbrella and dispatched to Raccoon City with one mission: to find and kill all remaining STARS members, so as to keep them quiet about what they experienced in the Spencer Mansion, and to prevent them from investigating Umbrella any further. As Nemesis advances, Jill flees from her home, while the creature stomps onward after her, leaving a trail of wreckage and flames in its wake. Somehow Jill is able to narrowly escape, and it's not long afterwards that she crosses paths with Brad Vickers on the streets of Raccoon City. Their rendezvous, however, is short-lived, because the two are soon overwhelmed by an oncoming mass of the undead. As Jill trudges onwards to make it to a nearby roof where the escape chopper seems to be waiting, Brad is bitten and decides to stay behind, sacrificing himself to buy time for Jill to escape. Carlos enters the scene. Jill makes it to the roof, but Nemesis is not far behind. The bioweapon destroys the chopper, and in a desperate attempt to save her life, Jill gets into a car and rams it into Nemesis, driving both it and herself off of the building's roof. But even as Jill crawls out of the car's wreckage and witnesses it explode right in front of her, Nemesis somehow emerges from the flames unscathed. Right in the nick of time, however, she is rescued by a man named Carlos Oliveira, who uses an anti-tank missile to deal with the monster, but not permanently. No, Nemesis is going to be around for a while. Now that they're able to catch their breaths for a moment though, Jill and Carlos have time for introductions. And it's at this point that she learns that Carlos is part of a UBCS team that, according to him, has been sent to Raccoon City to help people evacuate. But of course, given Jill's past with Umbrella and knowing everything that she knows about the company, her instant reaction is to distrust Carlos. She also sees, however, that helping Carlos, who says that he and his squad are in the process of getting subway trains up and running to get people out of the city, is the only option she has right now. Carlos's squad. Carlos leads Jill to the subway station where he introduces her to the rest of his squad. Nikolai Genovese, Tyrell Patrick, and their leader, Mikhail Victor. They brief Jill on their plan to get the subway train running and the tracks functional again, following which they'll be able to transport all of the civilians that are taking refuge in the station to beyond Raccoon City's limits. And though Jill has come nowhere close to trusting any of them, given that they are Umbrella employees with probably suspect motivations, she does agree to help them in their rescue efforts. Those efforts take her back out onto the streets of Raccoon City, with a good chunk of the game from that point onward seeing Jill traveling to and braving different horrors all through the city. From the poisonous Drain Demos at the power station, to countless zombies all over the town, to Hunter Gammas in the sewers and more. And of course, as you would expect, the relentless and terrifying Nemesis does not give up its pursuit of Jill either, and more than a few times she has to either fight or flee from the monster, only narrowly managing to do so each time. During her attempts to get the train running again, meanwhile, Jill also learns more about both Carlos and Nikolai, who seem to be polar opposites in terms of morality. Where Carlos genuinely seems like he's the only person interested in helping people and getting them out of the city, Nikolai clearly has hidden goals of his own. He and Jill butt heads on more than one occasion, and it quickly becomes clear to her that he is going to be trouble one way or another, but more on that in a bit. Ultimately, Jill is able to do what she needs to do to get the train running again, and after harrowing encounters with Nemesis, finds her way back to the station. Here, the squad splits up again. Jill climbs aboard with Nikolai, Mikhail, and a bunch of civilians, while Mikhail orders Carlos and Tyrell to stay behind and continue their other mission, which is to track down one Dr. Nathaniel Bard, a biologist in Umbrella's employ who has apparently been working on a vaccine for the T-virus. The train sets off, but obviously, things don't go to plan. None other than the Nemesis shows up again, attacking the train. But as Jill, on Mikhail's orders, tries to escape the car that the two of them are in, she is locked in and trapped by Nikolai. Nemesis, meanwhile, grabs Mikhail, who, in a bid to stop the creature, sacrifices himself by blowing himself up with C4. Nemesis is temporarily downed, but the train also derails as a result, and in the crash, Jill loses consciousness. Back to RPD. At this point, we switch focus to Carlos, who has playable sections of his own in Resident Evil 3. Carlos and Tyrell travel to the RPD building, where they believe that they will find Dr. Bard, with Mikhail having previously received intel that suggests that he might be in the STAR's office. As they enter the station, which happens a few hours before the beginning of Resident Evil 2, they spot a zombified Brad, attacking and taking a chunk out of Lieutenant Marvin Branagh. Branagh is able to escape, while Carlos and Tyrell put zombie Brad down, following which they enter the building and resume their search for Dr. Bard. When Carlos arrives at the STAR's office, however, Dr. Bard is nowhere to be seen, though the researcher soon contacts him and reveals some dire information. Bard informs Carlos that he fled from RPD a while back and is currently trapped in the Spencer Memorial Hospital, which, as luck would have it, has been overrun by zombies and bioweapons of all manner. What's more, Umbrella has apparently also started targeting and eliminating multiple scientists and researchers who it believes could blow the whistle on the company, and Bard, who has been researching a T-virus vaccine, is a top candidate for elimination. What Carlos doesn't know, however, is that it is none other than Nikolai who has been going after Umbrella researchers in the city, but we'll get to that. At this point, Carlos is also radioed by Jill, who has regained consciousness after the train crash. She tries to brief Carlos on everything, but their conversation is cut short because soon, predictably enough, Jill is attacked by Nemesis once again. By this point, the creature has mutated beyond all recognition and has turned into a terrifying, massive four-legged monstrosity. Jill takes Nemesis on in a harrowing fight once again, this time in front of an imposing clock tower. And though she is able to defeat her foe, but again, not permanently, she doesn't come through unscathed. Nemesis impales her in the arm, infecting her with the T-virus, following which she loses consciousness. Carlos's nightmares. Resident Evil 3 then shifts focus to Carlos once again, who finds an unconscious and deathly ill Jill at the clock tower and carries her to Spencer Memorial Hospital, where he hopes to retrieve a vaccine from Dr. Bard and use it to save Jill's life.
At the hospital, however, when Carlos does finally make it to Bard's office, he finds the researcher dead with a gunshot wound to his head, courtesy of NeiCaelum, unbeknownst to Carlos. Before dying though, Dr. Bard managed to record a final video message on his computer, which reveals startling things to Carlos. In his message, Bard reveals that it was Umbrella itself that developed the T-virus and is responsible for the outbreak in Raccoon City, something that Jill obviously knew, but Carlos had no knowledge of. Bard also reveals that he was ordered by Umbrella to create a vaccine, but that once the outbreak happened, the company's board decided to destroy it in hopes of erasing any evidence that could link them to the disaster. Thankfully, Carlos is able to retrieve the vaccine and use it on Jill, following which he decides to head to an underground facility named Nest 2, which, as Bard revealed in his final message, is where he safely stored more of that vaccine. Whatever Carlos does, however, he will have to do it quickly. It turns out that in just a few hours, the United States government will be launching a nuclear strike on Raccoon City in order to stop the spread of the infection and wipe out all of the zombies and monsters that roam the city. Though that, of course, will mean that any and all survivors still in the city will also be vaporized. As Carlos rushes off to Nest 2, he asks Tyrell to try and get in contact with someone, anyone who can put a stop to the strike, especially with the vaccine now potentially in play. When Jill awakens later, she is told by Tyrell that if the US government can get its hands on a vaccine, they won't nuke the city, and so she heads off as well, following Carlos into Nest 2. Nest 2. The facility serves as the setting for Resident Evil 3's conclusion, so there is a suitable barrage of nightmarish obstacles for Jill and Carlos to deal with, and for poor Tyrell, who loses his life to a vicious attack by Nemesis. Though Jill succeeds in synthesizing a vaccine, she is soon ambushed by none other than NeiCaelum, who, it turns out, has actually been hired by an unknown third party to not only sabotage Umbrella's plans to hide its role in the outbreak, but also gather combat data on Nemesis, not to mention other Umbrella bioweapons. And lo and behold, Jill is then soon attacked by Nemesis once again, which also proves to be the perfect opportunity for NeiCaelum to nab the vaccine from her. Jill, however, has only one concern just then: dealing with Nemesis once and for all. By the time of her final confrontation, the creature has mutated and transformed aggressively, and is eventually a little more than an amorphous blob of, stuff. Using a powerful and experimental railgun, however, Jill is able to finally destroy Nemesis for good. NeiCaelum turns chaos into leverage. While this had been going on, Carlos was in pursuit of NeiCaelum in hopes of retrieving the vaccine. And now that Nemesis has been dealt with, Jill followed suit, following the pair into the facility's rooftop. Here, things come to a head between Jill, Carlos, and NeiCaelum. NeiCaelum destroys the vaccine, dashing all hopes of survival for Raccoon City and everyone in it. In the ensuing scuffle, with Carlos's help, Jill succeeds in incapacitating NeiCaelum with a gunshot to the shoulder. When asked about who is his actual employer, NeiCaelum still refuses to yield that information, telling Jill that he will only answer her if she helps him escape the city. That, however, is obviously not to Jill's liking. She and Carlos decide to leave NeiCaelum behind and escape Raccoon City aboard a helicopter. As the chopper flies away, Raccoon City is struck by a nuclear missile, vaporizing and completely destroying everything within the city. In Resident Evil chronology, that is so far the last that we have seen of Raccoon City, though of course, we do know that we will be returning to the iconic location in the upcoming Resident Evil Requiem. In Resident Evil 3's final moments, meanwhile, just like Chris, Leon, and Claire before her, Jill vows to put a stop to Umbrella's activities once and for all and expose everything that the company has been involved in. And that's it for our recap of Resident Evil 3. When we return for part 8 of our Resident Evil recap, we'll cover the events of Code Veronica, which takes us to Europe and shifts attention to the Redfield siblings. Having gone through the dramatic events that unfold in Raccoon City, eventually ending in its complete destruction, our Resident Evil recap is ready to move into the franchise's next phase, because let's face it, it was with Resident Evil Code Veronica that the franchise really started leaning hard into the corniness that it became increasingly synonymous with. So here in part 8 of our Resident Evil recap then, we're going to talk about the outlandish events of Code Veronica. Before we get into the events of the game proper, however, we're going to have to do something we do often with our Resident Evil recaps. Pause, wind the clock back, and drop some crucial backstory. The Ashfords. Umbrella Corporation was, of course, founded by Oswell Spencer, James Marcus, and Edward Ashford.
And though we've spent a good bit of time speaking about the former two up to this point, now it's Ashford's time to shine. Of course, as we touched on earlier as part of the three Umbrella co-founders' intense rivalry, Edward Ashford was killed under mysterious circumstances all the way back in 1968. But that wasn't where the Ashford family's role in the story ended. Edward was survived by his son, Alexander, another gifted man working for Umbrella Corporation, though his interests, unlike his peers, lay more in genetics. To secure his family's fortune and position in Umbrella then, Alexander concocted a bizarre yet ambitious plan to use the DNA of the late and considered great Lady Veronica Ashford, who was his great-great-grandmother, and create a clone who would surpass all human benchmarks in terms of genetics and intelligence. Extreme eugenics, just to say the least. And so began Project Code Veronica, which did succeed, but not without caveats. The result of the project was not one but two children, a girl, Alexia Ashford, and a boy, Alfred Ashford. Of the two of them, the former was considered the prize child, so to speak, because as it turned out, she, unlike her brother, was exactly the sort of child prodigy that Alexander had been hoping to create. Both Alexia and Alfred, however, resented their family greatly, and for most of their lives, the only comfort the two could find was in each other. It wasn't long before the twins discovered the truth of their birth, however, and almost instantly, they were set on revenge. They captured their so-called father and injected him with the T. Veronica virus, an experimental strain of the progenitor virus that the aforementioned Lady Veronica had been able to concoct by mixing the T virus with queen ant DNA. Alexander responded to the experiment violently, though, turning into a hideous monstrosity, following which the twins locked him away. In isolation, with mutations and mental decay stacking up over a prolonged period of time, Alexander eventually became a monster that would be dubbed Nosferatu, but more on that later. Back to the twins, because there is still more to talk about with this pair. Alexia continued to work on the T. Veronica virus, and eventually she came to the decision that herself would be a suitable test subject for the virus. She injected herself with it, and in order to avoid the sort of decay and mutations that Alexander had been put through, Alexia put herself into cryo-sleep, believing that doing so would allow her body the time it needed to adjust to the virus. Alexia, of course, was declared publicly dead, following which Alfred became the official head of the Ashford family, though he wasn't doing too well for himself. In the absence of his beloved sister, Alfred found it more than a little difficult to cope, and his mental health continued to worsen until it finally broke, getting to a point where he had subconsciously developed a second persona for himself where he completely believed himself to be Alexia to the point of even dressing like her. Claire Redfield's search begins. From here, we get to Resident Evil Code Veronica's story proper, which takes place in late 1998, a few months after Raccoon City's nuking. Claire Redfield, survivor of the devastating incident, is still looking for her brother, and Chris's trail has led her to Europe, specifically to Paris, where she hopes to find him in an Umbrella facility. When she does arrive at the facility, however, things quickly go wrong. And how often have we said that throughout this recap? Though she successfully infiltrates the lab, she is then overwhelmed and then captured promptly afterwards. Afterwards, she's then quickly transported away and taken to a separate Umbrella prison facility, this one run by the Ashford side of the company, on Rockfort Island, which it won't surprise you to know is far from a friendly place, and it's going to get unfriendlier still. Because Claire's arrival at Rockfort coincides with other unrelated chaos. Specifically, the island is being attacked by a paramilitary group called HCF, which is led by none other than good old Albert Wesker. And yes, he's back. It turns out he didn't die when he was attacked by a tyrant during the Spencer Mansion incident towards the end of Resident Evil 1, and has, in fact, even gained what are effectively superpowers as a result of being infected. And now he's looking for the T. Veronica virus, which has led him to Rockfort. HCF's attack on Rockfort is brutal, and predictably enough, results in a barrage of BOWs and a T-virus strain accidentally being set loose on the island. Amidst this fresh outbreak, however, Claire, after escaping from captivity, finds a new ally in Steve Burnside, another fellow Umbrella prisoner who was captured after his father, an Umbrella employee, was caught stealing and selling the company's secrets. Braving the dangers of Rockfort Island, Claire and Steve search for any way to escape. After Steve uncovers Umbrella data showing Chris is under surveillance, along with the island's coordinates, Claire contacts Leon and asks him to warn Chris and pass the location along. Later, Claire and Steve find a plane that can get them off of the island. But though they do climb aboard and take off, what they don't know is that Alfred Ashford was 2 steps ahead of them, having secretly set the plane to autopilot so they would take them to a location of his choosing. And that location? A secret Umbrella facility all the way up in Antarctica. Things only get worse when they arrive. They find that not only has a large chunk of the Rockfort facility evacuated to the Antarctica base, it also turns out that they brought the T-virus outbreak back with them. Which means, once again, Claire and Steve find themselves in a facility overrun with zombies and all manner of bioweapons. But that's not all, as you may have expected. The two also square off against members of the Ashford family. First, they go head-to-head with Alfred Ashford himself, who they are able to defeat in a fight, but not permanently. Following which, he decides to finally bring his sister Alexia, who, as we mentioned, is infected by the T. Veronica virus, out of cryosleep, all of 15 years after she went under. Meanwhile, someone else they face is Alexander Ashford, or whatever it is that he has now become. Remember Nosferatu? Well, yeah, that thing. Claire takes the horrific creature on in combat, and after a desperate struggle, she is able to kill him, finally bringing his tortured existence to an end. Finally, in an attempt to escape the base in a commandeered truck, Claire and Steve are also attacked by the formidable, just to say the least, and terrifying, to say the very least, T. Veronica virus mutated Alexia Ashford, and this fight does not go well for them. The two are knocked out and promptly afterward taken away as Alexia's prisoners. Chris returns. As we often do in Resident Evil games, here we switch focus away from Claire Redfield to focus on Code Veronica's second primary protagonist, her brother, former STARS agent Chris Redfield. Immediately upon learning of Claire's location and everything that is happening on Rockfort Island from Leon, Chris heads to the island himself, though he doesn't find his sister there, of course. He finds his old pal and now sworn enemy Albert Wesker. But though the two of them have beef to settle, at present they have other priorities, and so they both head to Umbrella's Antarctica base, Chris to find his sister and Wesker to nab the T. Veronica virus. Chris arrives at the Antarctica base not long after and soon manages to track down Claire. She tells him that before they leave, they have to find Steve, who is being held separately. But when they do find him, he's not exactly in the state that they had hoped he would be in. It turns out that he's been infected with the T. Veronica virus, and the infection is beginning to take hold. In an uncontrolled fit of rage, Steve attacks Claire, though it soon becomes clear that he hasn't yet fully succumbed to the T. Veronica's many mutations. He fights the virus from within and is able to stop his attacks on Claire, following which he turns his attention to none other than Alexia herself. Alexia, however, is far more powerful and deadlier than Steve is at this point, given how long the virus has been in her body, and the fight between them is not exactly evenly matched. In a nutshell, she completely destroys him, and as he lays there in the aftermath with his body broken, he reverts back to his actual self, before finally succumbing to his injuries and dying. In their fight against Alexia, however, our heroes have some unexpected help from Wesker, who, for his own reasons, is hell-bent on defeating her and taking a sample of the T. Veronica virus for himself. Alexia and Wesker take each other on, and with Chris's help, the latter is able to come out on top. Chris, meanwhile, activates the Antarctica facility's self-destruct function, because every Resident Evil game obviously just has to end with a self-destruct countdown sequence. And immediately afterwards, he and Claire attempt to escape. Their attempt is cut short, however, by Alexia, who isn't quite dead yet. In a final battle against her, though, the two are able to take her down with the help of a weapon called the Linear Launcher, which was developed long ago by Alexander Ashford specifically for the purpose of dealing with T. Veronica experiments gone wrong should the need arise. Wesker shows off some cool new moves. But that's not the end of the obstacles our heroes have to deal with. Wesker rears his face again, and while Claire prepares for takeoff in a plane that will hopefully fly them far away from Antarctica, Chris and Wesker duke it out in a good, old-fashioned hand-to-hand duel. Wesker has the upper hand thanks to his literal superpowers, though Chris nonetheless succeeds in injuring his former boss enough to give him time to escape. Chris and Claire aboard the plane are able to fly away while the facility blows up in their wake. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to them,
Wesker is also able to escape, and he does so with the T. Veronica infected corpse of Steve Burnside in tow. What does he want with the Pokedex of viruses that he's accruing? Well, we're going to get to that later on down the road. For now, that is our full recap of Resident Evil Code Veronica. When we return for part 9 in our recap series, we'll be covering Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles, a game with a few non-canon story segments, but also several crucial canon sequences that answer a lot of lingering questions from the earlier entries. In part 8 of our Resident Evil recap, we covered the events of Code Veronica, from the reunion of the Redfield siblings to the deepest, darkest secrets of the Ashcroft family. In part 9, however, we're taking a brief detour, a little deviation to explore what happened to a select few characters after the events of Resident Evil 1 and 2. What happened to Albert Wesker, last seen faking his death in the Spencer Mansion incident? How about Ada Wong, last seen faking her death after the outbreak in Raccoon City? Just what were they up to between games? The answer can be found in, of all things, an on-rails light gun shooter, Resident Evil The Umbrella Chronicles. It was released in 2007 exclusively for the Nintendo Wii, but despite its spin-offy nature, the events of The Umbrella Chronicles are actually crucial to understanding the full narrative picture. Which is kind of funny because a significant chunk of the game consists of retellings of Resident Evil 0, Resident Evil 1, and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, which don't mirror their core stories at all, and thus aren't canon. So what about everything else? Well, let's start with the core narrator, Albert Wesker, who outlines his survival at the hands of the T-002 tyrant in Spencer Mansion. As it turns out, the T-virus, which he had injected himself with beforehand, is what was responsible for his survival, effectively mending his wound and bringing him back to the land of the living. While tasked by Umbrella to destroy Arklay Laboratory, Wesker was already serving as a double agent for the rival company and sought to steal information from its computer. Unfortunately, the Red Queen AI, created to oversee Umbrella's assets and protect its employees, and the timely arrival of Sergei Vladimir, commander of the Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, or UBCS, would result in Wesker being locked off from the files. And yes, the Red Queen is named as such from the first live-action Resident Evil film, though they have nothing in common with regards to their origins. After being denied access, Wesker swore vengeance on the AI and made his escape. This also marked the appearance of his superhuman capabilities. Thanks to the T-virus, Sergei moved the UMF-013, a computer core which contained the Red Queen AI and all of the corporation's data on its heinous experiments, to a secret location in Raccoon City. However, he would shift it again to an Umbrella laboratory in Caucasus. It's also where he moved Talos, a powerful T-011 with powerful armor and a computer for remote control via the Red Queen. Thanks to Sergei's oversight, the project was also officially complete. The tyrant capable of dispatching other lesser tyrants was thus online. This led to the sole new scenario in Umbrella Chronicles, which surprisingly jumped ahead to 2003. And remember, the Raccoon City incident took place in 1998. Investigating strange incidents occurring in Caucasus, Wesker and Umbrella's rival company soon learned that this is where Umbrella had effectively been hiding out. Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine also caught wind of the events, and after a short run-in with Wesker, they would venture to the laboratory to take the fight to the corporation. Eventually, the pair would go up against the Talos and defeat it, despite the creature mutating further. So where was Wesker in the midst of all of this? Well, say what you will about the man, but he knows how to hold a grudge. First, he managed to sway an employee within the lab to cause a T-virus outbreak. That same employee helped him slip past the Red Queen, and while searching for more details on the UMF-013, he happened upon blueprints to get inside. Chris and Jill had already been following Wesker, but that was also within his calculations, as he left them to battle Talos, while he would then pursue the UMF-013. Despite this, the Red Queen and Sergei were well aware of his machinations. The latter sent a pair of Ivans, special T-103 tyrants that served as his bodyguards, after Wesker, which was a mistake because he handily defeated them without a scratch. With the Talos occupied with Chris and Jill, Sergei used a modified T-virus to infect himself, mutating into a powerful BOW. It still wasn't enough, however, as Wesker defeated him.
From there, he would steal all of the UMF-013's data and then leak it to the world, thus ensuring Umbrella's swift end in trials following the aftermath of the Raccoon City destruction incident. The Red Queen was wiped, and shortly after, Umbrella Corporation would shut down. Meanwhile, Wesker would venture forth with his own plans. He wouldn't act alone, though, as another key operative quickly became embroiled. We're of course talking about none other than Ada Wong, an operative for the HCF, Wesker's special unit under Umbrella's rival company. She was tasked with obtaining a G-virus sample back in 1998, her whole reason for venturing to Raccoon City to begin with. Things took a turn after she encountered Leon S. Kennedy and, for whatever reason, decided to help him, even tending to his wounds. She somehow survived the incident of Resident Evil 2, and even helped Leon defeat Mr. X along the way. Despite not obtaining a sample, all was not lost. She would discover William Birkin's mutated corpse during the self-destruction of Nest and use a tissue from whatever was left as her sample. After rendezvousing with a liaison who took their life instead, and reconvening with Wesker, who went from disappointed at her helping Leon to more amicable upon seeing the sample, she was informed that Raccoon City would soon be bombed and the escape window was closing. It was only through reaching an Umbrella helicopter and hanging off of it with her grappling gun that she managed to evacuate. And funnily enough, this would be the same helicopter that Sergei uses to move the UMF-013 out of Raccoon City. Then there's Hunk. Back when Birkin brokered a deal with the US government in exchange for asylum, with his family included, Hunk was sent in to steal the G-virus and eliminate him on Umbrella's orders. Leading Alpha Team, they accomplished this objective and left, assuming that Birkin was dead, not knowing that he infected himself with the virus. Now mutated, he would go on to slaughter Alpha Team in the sewers, causing the G-virus to spill out from its container and contributing to the wider outbreak in Raccoon City. After the last of his allies died, Hunk continued with his mission, eventually getting in touch with Nighthawk, an Umbrella Security Service pilot, to evacuate. After taking on all manner of monstrosities, including a T-00 Tyrant, Hunk tells Nighthawk to leave without him. Surprisingly, the latter decides to stick to their deal and they both evacuate, thus allowing Hunk to deliver the G-virus sample to Umbrella. And that more or less concludes the canon content in Umbrella Chronicles, aside from a brief subchapter that shows Rebecca Chambers heading to a rendezvous point with Bravo Team following the events of Resident Evil 0. She would eventually meet up with Richard Aiken, and both spotted Sergei leaving with one of his Ivans. The rest, of course, is history. The final scenario ends with Wesker now in full control. Despite Oswald Spencer still being alive, Wesker mocks how the former is now a fugitive in the world he sought to control. Quote, "We shall meet again before the conclusion of this drama," he said, sitting all pretty in his supervillain chair. Quote, "You will then learn of the history I will write for this world." Well, that's it for Part 9. When we return for Part 10, we'll be setting up the events of Resident Evil 4 Remake through another unexpected spin-off, Resident Evil: The Dark Side Chronicles. We're officially on Part 10 of our Resident Evil recap, following the mostly non-canon but also surprisingly canon events of Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles. Today we'll be taking a closer look at The Dark Side Chronicles, another on-rails light gun game which takes place in 2002. It comprises 4 scenarios, but 2 of them are very much like the filler from Umbrella Chronicles. Memories of a Lost City and Game of Oblivion provide a condensed overview of the stories from Resident Evil 2 and Code Veronica. The latter is somewhat interesting because we actually see Alexander Ashford, son of Edward Ashford, who is one of the founders of Umbrella Corporation. Otherwise, they serve as little more than flashbacks for the main narrative, which is Operation Javier. And to say it's important for many reasons, well, that would be an understatement. Operation Javier. This operation focuses on Leon S. Kennedy, who would join the anti-Umbrella pursuit and investigation team under the US government's STRATCOM to ensure Sherry's safety. Well, this meant he couldn't tell the world about Umbrella and the truth behind Raccoon City's outbreak because it would expose the government's deals with the corporation. Leon would venture forth to destroy what remains. In that 4-year interval, he would undergo extensive training and undertake various missions. However, it wasn't until 2002 that he received his biggest yet, locating Javier Hidalgo, a cartel leader, in Amparo, South America. He seemingly has been in touch with the Umbrella Corporation, and who knows what mayhem that may unleash. Joining Leon in this mission is Jack Krauser, a soldier for the United States Special Operations Command and part-time mercenary, but none of his experience could prepare them for what awaited. After meeting up with Leon, sans their guide, they find a nearby village, Mixcoatl, with zombies everywhere and no survivors, save for the guide who's quickly disposed of by a massive bioorganic creature. After the guide tells them of a girl who brought disaster to the village, the two continue, dispatching any threats and happening upon her in an abandoned building. However, the same BOW from before appears. Leon manages to deal significant damage to the creature, which then escapes, and subsequently learns that the character in question is Manuela. She helps as their new guide, while Leon explains his past to Krauser and the experiences he had fighting against Umbrella. Eventually, they arrive at a dam and must contend with Javier himself. As he releases more bioweapons to fight against Leon and Krauser, the two become separated from Manuela, though she would later escape. They subsequently learned that she's Javier's daughter. Not only that, she's been infected with the T. Veronica virus, the same created by Alexia Ashford in Code Veronica. The big revelation. It's thus revealed that Hilda, Javier's wife, was afflicted with an illness local to the region with no cure. However, thanks to his extensive wealth, Javier managed to procure Umbrella's T virus and used it on his wife. While her disease was eradicated, she transformed into the massive BOW seen at the start of this mission and seemingly lost all reason. We say seemingly because she won't attack her daughter or Javier. Mortified but unable to put his wife out of her misery, he kept her confined at his estate. Despite the horrifying consequences, he still dipped into the black market, using infected members of his cartel as muscle. Things took another turn several years later when Manuela was next to suffer the same illness as her mother. This time Javier used the T. Veronica virus, and once again, it worked. But to ensure that she did not transform, he would take to harvesting organs from the inhabitants of Mixcoatl. The revelation horrified Manuela, and she would flee her estate, causing Javier to lose it. Back to the present, Leon and Krauser find themselves in a battle against a mutated Hilda. Pulling out all of the stops, and with some help from Manuela, whose singing subdued her mother, they manage to take Hilda down. It comes at a price, however, as Krauser's arm is severely injured. As Manuela bids farewell to her mother, the group nonetheless carries on, despite Javier remaining at large. The battle against Javier. Meanwhile, with no other choice and desperate to reclaim his daughter, Javier fuses with a Veronica plant, turning into the V-complex. Due to its unstable nature, it presented perhaps the biggest threat to the region, which meant Leon and Krauser had to destroy it. While the two succeeded in destroying several of its limbs, it wasn't enough. It was Manuela who realized that she could inflict some serious damage in the most unorthodox way possible, with her blood, which was flammable. The problem is, she would eventually bleed out and die if she continued the fight. As a result, Javier regains momentary control of his senses and incites Leon to kill him. Our man obliges and takes him out, once and for all. As the rescue chopper arrives, Manuela is taken into custody by the US government. Believing she should have died with her father, Leon tells her to continue living, especially for the sake of the other people who lost their lives. Krauser would end up discharged due to his injury, and several months later he passed away due to an accident. Or at least, that's what Leon heard. The truth. Well, the truth is that he faked his death. Upon completing Operation Javier, a new bonus scenario called Darkness Falls is available, offering Krauser's perspective throughout the mission. As he learns more about Leon's history, especially with the Raccoon City destruction incident, he begins to respect him more. However, Krauser also felt some jealousy over the fact that he's working directly under US President Graham. While keen to succeed and prove himself, he also becomes more enamored by the T. Veronica virus. After getting injured, Krauser begins to feel even more resentful of Leon. Seeing the power of the V-complex, he believes it's the source for becoming stronger. As Leon consoles Manuela, Krauser smiles back, but his thoughts reveal something else entirely, as he calls his partner cruel for his words. Quote, "There's nothing left to say. For you and I, Leon, we're merely different sides of the same coin." After being discharged for his injury, Krauser effectively abandons his military life and seeks out the one person he believes can help him, Albert Wesker. Interestingly, at the end of Darkness Falls, as he ponders whether he could help Krauser regain his strength, it's revealed that Wesker is actually watching the battle against the V-Complex from a distance. As its corpse burns up, he dons his signature shades and walks away. And that concludes all of the canon events of Resident Evil: The Darkside Chronicles, alongside giving us a closer look at the mission that seemingly elevated Leon up the ranks, so much so that he was solely entrusted with rescuing President Graham's daughter on his own. It also revealed Krauser's hidden backstory, why he was hostile towards Leon, how he came to work for Wesker, and ultimately his mentality. All of it began with the goal of seeking out power, ultimately setting a path towards his own ruin. But that's a story for another time, which we'll delve into with part 11 of our series, outlining the events of RE4 Remake. In part 10, we took a look at the events of Operation Javier, and now with the 11th part of our Resident Evil recap, we're turning our attention to RE4 Remake. Now before we begin, this video is based on our understanding of RE4 Remake's story and lore, and reflects our interpretation of its events as a refresher before Resident Evil Requiem. As always, we recommend that you make your own informed call by looking into the game yourself and ensuring that it matches your expectations, standards, and personal values. The setting. The game is set in the year 2004, 6 years after the total destruction of Raccoon City. And as you might imagine, a lot has happened in those 6 years. The most significant change is that Umbrella Corporation, which had consistently been the series' primary antagonist up to this point, is no more. Their corrupt activities and experiments became fully public, leading to the company becoming bankrupted and shut down, and its only living founder, Oswald E. Spencer, being declared a wanted man all over the world, following which he went into and still remains in hiding. So how exactly did that happen? Well, as things were unraveling over the years, it was clear that it was only a matter of time before Umbrella's activities became public. But one of the biggest killing blows for the company was dealt by Albert Wesker. Providing testimony as an anonymous, high-value witness, Wesker spilled the beans not only on the company's inner workings and on Spencer's role in all of it. But of course, he didn't do it out of the goodness of his heart. This is Wesker after all, which means he's always got his own suspect motivations. As we've already seen in Part 9 through the Umbrella Chronicles, Wesker was able to infiltrate an Umbrella facility that Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine also happened to be investigating at the time, and managed to recover a significant chunk of their files and data. His goal, of course, was to primarily use that data for himself in his world domination plans, but that also allowed him to blow the lid off of Umbrella's long-standing secrets. Leon Kennedy enters the scene. Moving away from Umbrella, the 6 years between the destruction of Raccoon City and the beginning of RE4 Remake's events also brought about major changes in the life of our protagonist, Leon S. Kennedy. When we last saw him, he was a rookie cop on the first day of his job and was trying to navigate the horrors of Raccoon City. But by 2004, he had turned into a highly trained super agent for the United States government after undergoing rigorous training in a top-secret program. As part of that training in 2002, a couple of years before RE4 Remake's events, Leon and fellow super agent Jack Krauser were involved in a covert mission in South America called Operation Javier, which saw Krauser to go rogue and join forces with Wesker. We'll talk more about Krauser later though, because now it's time to get to RE4 Remake proper. On direct orders from the United States President himself, Leon finds himself traveling to a remote village in Spain. Why is that? Well, to rescue the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, who'd been kidnapped by a horrible cult and is now being held captive, according to the government's intel, in said Spanish village. A bit of backstory. Now let's pause and go over some backstory, as we often do before we proceed with Leon's mission in Spain. Well, for starters, who are these people? Led by a man named Sadler, the cult has a weapon at its disposal, and that weapon, as is usually the case in Resident Evil universes, is a bioweapon. Specifically, it's an ancient parasitic organism, discovered by Sadler in a preserved state with an amber, which can be used to infect people and then turn them into hideous, horrifying monstrosities that, crucially, can also be mind-controlled. Sadler's ultimate goal, like with most of the over-the-top and ridiculous villains, is world domination, which is why he now holds Ashley Graham captive, so that he can infect her with the organism and send her back to the United States, where she will in turn be able to infect her father, the president, thus allowing Sadler direct control over him. and as you would expect, he has plenty of people assisting him. For instance, there's the aforementioned Jack Krauser, who was the one who kidnapped Ashley and brought her to the village. But there are other forces at play as well, like good old Albert Wesker, who also wants to get his hands on this parasite as part of his nefarious plans. To do so, Wesker has sent in his own agents as well, which includes not only Krauser, but also none other than Ada Wong herself. Just as she was dispatched by Wesker to Raccoon City several years prior in order to retrieve a sample of the G-Virus, now she finds herself in Spain, where her ultimate goal is to retrieve a sample of the amber and take it back to Wesker. Ada plays a constant role throughout the events of RE4 Remake, with the Separate Ways DLC in particular focusing exclusively on her side of the story, which runs concurrent to Leon's. But for now, let's go ahead and get back to Leon, who quickly realizes upon his arrival in the village that things are going to be far more complicated than he expected. The entire village has essentially been overrun by an infection, with virtually all inhabitants having been turned into mind-controlled freaks and monsters. Meeting Luis. As Leon deals with the crazed villagers and begins his search for Ashley, he comes across someone who, like him, isn't infected yet. Luis Serra, a former Umbrella researcher who was eventually recruited by Sadler to work on the parasite, but now finds himself on the run from the cult. Though Luis is, at this point, by no means aligned with Sadler or Umbrella, what Leon doesn't know is that in his attempts to escape the cult, he also reached out to Wesker, promising him a sample of the amber in exchange for his safety, which is why Ada has been dispatched to the village. Leon and Luis's meeting is cut short when they're attacked by the village chief, Bitores Mendez, who also happens to be infected by the parasite. Leon loses consciousness and is infected by the parasite, and when he comes to, he finds that he and Luis are both together in captivity. With each other's help, they are able to escape, following which the two part ways again. But before they do, however, Luis tells Leon that Ashley is being moved to a specific location in the village, which Leon instantly makes a beeline for. Rescuing Ashley. Arriving at the location, Leon is able to rescue Ashley from a horde of infected villagers, only to learn that she, like him, has also been infected. Mendez, the village chief, gives pursuit, and ultimately Leon is forced to take him on in a desperate fight in an abandoned warehouse, where Leon is able to kill him. In the aftermath, he is told that a rescue chopper won't be able to land in the village due to poor weather conditions, which causes Leon and Ashley to proceed ahead. Later on, Leon crosses paths with Ada 6 years after their first meeting in Raccoon City. The two continue to meet throughout the rest of the game, and though they continue to help each other as much as they can, Ada never reveals her true motivations and plans to Leon, playfully batting away his questions as he knows all too well that she has a habit of doing. Leon and Ashley then meet Ramon Salazar, who also happens to be loyal to Sadler, and orders his forces to capture Ashley again, which they succeed in doing. Leon continues onward, determined to rescue her once more, and he eventually crosses paths with Luis once more. Luis informs Leon that he knows how to help him and Ashley. If they can get to Luis's lab on a nearby island, they can perform a procedure that will remove the parasite from their bodies before they fully give in to its infection and fall under Sadler's control. An old face returns. With a plan in mind, Leon and Luis proceed forward, but it's not long before they're attacked by Jack Krauser, who stabs and kills Luis, and after a fight against Leon, retreats. Before dying, Luis hands Leon the keys to his lab, following which Leon fights his way to Salazar, who holds Ashley captive. But though Leon is able to fight and kill a heavily mutated Salazar, he doesn't do it in time, and is on scene to witness Krauser leaving for the island on a boat with Ashley in tow. With Ada's help, Leon chases after him in a separate boat. Soon, Leon arrives on the island, which is where the story comes to a close. One of several challenges Leon faces on the island is a final confrontation with Jack Krauser, who proves to be a predictably worthy adversary, not only because he is highly trained as a super soldier, but also because he is infected himself. Leon is able to overcome Krauser, however, and the fight ends with the latter's death. Leon soon meets back up with Ashley, and at long last, and with some help from Ada, he's able to successfully take her to Luis's lab and rid both her and himself of the infection. From that point forward, in Leon's mind, it's clear what has to happen next. Sadler has to die. And as you would expect, that is exactly what the game's final act is. With Ada's help, Leon takes Sadler on and is ultimately able to defeat and kill him. But Ada, as you would expect, is not going to forget about her primary mission, as much as she doesn't want to see Leon killed. After Sadler's death, she reveals to Leon that she has succeeded in retrieving a sample of the amber and climbs aboard a helicopter, which she uses to escape the island, which, in true Resident Evil fashion, is on the verge of total destruction, with Sadler's facilities self-destructing. Leon, meanwhile, escapes with Ashley on a jet ski. The twist. In the game's final moments, we see Ada contacting Wesker while aboard the chopper. She finally asks him what he intends to do with the amber and what his ultimate plans are. And though he is far from forthcoming with the actual details, he does let her know that his plans are going to result in the deaths of billions of people, something that he takes no issue with whatsoever. Disgusted by Wesker's reckless disregard and horrified by his plans, Ada holds the chopper's pilot at gunpoint and tells him to change course. Where she's headed and what she intends to do with the amber now that she no longer intends to hand it off to Wesker remains a mystery. But Wesker, to no one's surprise, always has fallback options up his sleeve. As revealed at the end of Separate Ways DLC, he's able to retrieve Krauser's infected corpse from the island. And that's our recap of RE4 Remake. When we return for part 12 of our recap, we'll be going over the events of Resident Evil Revelations, which is set between the events of RE4 Remake and RE5. In part 11, we spoke about the events of RE4 Remake, and here in part 12 of our Resident Evil recap then, we're going to recount the events of Resident Evil Revelations 1. Now, before we begin, this video is based on our understanding of Resident Evil Revelations' story and lore, and reflects our interpretation of its events as a refresher before Resident Evil Requiem. As always, we recommend that you make your own informed call by looking into the game yourself and ensuring that it matches your expectations, standards, and personal values. Also, Resident Evil Revelations' story adds next to nothing to the overarching saga and isn't really a good game, so playing it isn't worth your time. And just a heads up before we dive in, this is a newly edited, expanded, and restructured version of our earlier recap, now presented in 4K at 60 FPS. This entire recap series also includes coverage of Outbreak, Outbreak File Number 2, Umbrella Chronicles, and Darkside Chronicles, entries that we did not include the first time around. So with that out of the way, let's get started. The setting. Resident Evil Revelations is set in 2005, about a year after the events of RE4 Remake, and shines the spotlight once again on the duo of protagonists that the series originally started out with in the first outing, former STARS members Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield, who are now members of an international organization called Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, or the BSAA, one that the two helped set up together. Before we get into the harrowing mission for the BSAA in RE Revelations, however, there is, as per usual, some important backstory for us to get to. And that's because there is one significant event that informs much of what happens throughout the game. We are referring to what becomes known as the Terra Grigia Panic, which culminated with the total destruction of the Mediterranean city of Terra Grigia, following in Raccoon City's footsteps about a year before this game kicks off. And how exactly did things get to that point? It all started when the city developed Regisolis, a powerful satellite that could reflect solar rays onto the city's solar panels. A bioterrorist organization took issue with not only the European Union's construction of the city of Terra Grigia, but also the satellite, and the newly formed Federal Bioterrorism Commission, created by the United States after the Raccoon City disaster, moves in to contain the outbreak. It isn't enough. With the situation spiraling beyond control, FBC Director Morgan Lansdale authorized the Regisolis satellite weapon. The result is catastrophic. Terra Grigia is essentially wiped off the map, reduced to ruin as the city collapses. The Haunted Ship. Fast forward 1 year, and reports of bioterrorist organization resurfacing begin to circulate. That's where Jill Valentine enters the story. Acting on Clive O'Brien's orders, she and BSAA agent Parker Luciani are sent to the Queen Zenobia, an abandoned cruise ship adrift in the Mediterranean. The mission is simple on paper. Locate Chris Redfield and Jessica Shurawat, who were investigating bioterrorist organization alleged to return before abruptly going dark. Given the circumstances, it doesn't take long for Jill and Parker to realize that something about this whole operation feels dangerously off. Jill and Parker arrive on the Queen Zenobia as Resident Evil Revelations kicks off. And it's not long before they, oh so predictably, realize that things on the abandoned cruise ship are far worse than they could have imagined. The ship, you see, it's been taken over by another new virus, the T-Abyss virus. And what does the bioterror group plan to do with the T-Abyss virus? Well, their goal is to infect a large portion of the world's oceans in retaliation for their defeat during the Terra Grigia panic. Before Jill and Parker boarded the ship, FBC agents Rachel Foley boards the Queen Zenobia with Raymond Vester as part of an FBC assignment framed as a cleanup job, an operation that, knowingly or not, helps remove sensitive material from the ship. Separated inside the ship, Rachel follows signs of recent activity, gets ambushed, and when Jill Valentine arrives moments later, she catches a brutal glimpse of Rachel being slammed into a window until she's finally brought down for good. Jill and Parker don't get far before the Queen Zenobia shows its hand. They quickly realize Chris and Jessica were never aboard. Both were chasing a separate bioterrorist organization lead at a nearby airstrip. It's a setup. Chris Redfield enters the fray. Now we pivot to Chris Redfield and Jessica Sharawat. BSAA Chief Clive R. O'Brien contacts them with some bad news. Jill Valentine and Parker Luciani have vanished. With no time to waste, he sends the pair straight to the Queen Zenobia, but unknowingly lands on its sister ship, Queen Zemiramis. At the same time, Keith Lumley and Quint Ketchum, members of BSAA, are chasing a separate lead, quietly investigating Valcoin Moki Airport. Quint also starts connecting dots that suggest this revival isn't what it looks like, but we're going to come back to what that really means. When Jill and Parker come to, they're held in separate rooms, but they manage to find each other again and push deeper into the vessel. Along the way, they run into Raymond Vester, an FBC agent and Parker's former partner from his days in the Bureau. Vester is clearly working on an angle of his own on the Zenobia, but when pressed, he refuses to say what the FBC is doing on this ship. Meanwhile, as they explore the ship, the duo also learn more about the T-Abyss virus, and about the FBC's role in the destruction of Terra Grigia, or most of it at any rate, and more on that in a bit. In fact, it very much seems like FBC Director Morgan Lansdale has some suspect plans in motion, because he ends up activating Regia Solis once again, and this time aims it directly at the Queen Zenobia, hoping to destroy the ship and all of the evidence aboard. Jill and Parker are able to stop the satellite's attack, but not before it does a good bit of damage to the ship, following which it slowly starts to sink. Chris and Jessica eventually make it aboard the Queen Zenobia, reuniting with Jill and Parker soon afterwards. Before they can regroup properly, they encounter a man, only for Jessica to shoot him just as he appears ready to reveal something important. The man is unmasked as Raymond Vester, an FBC agent. He seems to die from the wound, but not before leaning in and whispering something inaudible to Parker. With the situation deteriorating, the team splits up. Parker and Jessica head for the engine room, hoping to halt the ship's slow descent into the ocean, while Jill and Chris push toward a concealed lab where a bioterrorist organization manages the T-Abyss virus. Their objective is simple: neutralize the pathogen before it can be dispersed into the world's seas. They manage to do exactly that, but the mission starts unraveling in some other ways. Chris and Jill are contacted by FBC head Morgan Lansdale, who reveals that the FBC and bioterrorist organization are actually secretly working together to orchestrate the Terra Grigia panic, with Lansdale's goal at the time being to use the incident as a means of increasing both funding and legitimacy for the FBC. Parker and Jessica, meanwhile, hit a roadblock of their own when Parker turns his gun on Jessica, telling her that Raymond Vester told him before dying that Jessica was actually an FBC mole. Jessica's able to overpower Parker, however, before triggering the ship's self-destruct sequence and making a run for it. Jill and Chris make it off the ship just before it detonates, escaping aboard a BSAA helicopter, but Parker isn't as fortunate. Sprinting for the helipad alongside the other agents, the platform gives way beneath him, sending him plummeting into a roaring fire as the explosion tears through the vessel. Once they're airborne, Jill and Chris receive a call from their commander, Clive R. O'Brien, who admits he was the one behind the Queen Zenobia operation, an attempt to gather proof of Morgan Lansdale's involvement in the Terra Grigia panic. And around the same time, Keith Lumley and Quint Ketchum's Valcoin Moki findings make the real twist clear.
The revival was staged by Clive R. O'Brien and Raymond Vester to draw Morgan Lansdale out into a rash cover-up. A strike is ordered to kill them, but the two escape. Also, this is where Rachel's assignment fits into the bigger picture. The Bureau didn't just send agents to investigate, it sent someone to sanitize the scene. Her cleanup brief was the FBC's early attempts to remove anything that could later connect the Zenobia incident to Morgan Lansdale and the Terra Grigia panic. Now, coming back to the topic at hand, the evidence has now been obliterated, along with the ship itself. Still, O'Brien insists the mission isn't over. He tells them about the Queen Dido, Zenobia's sister ship, buried beneath the ruins of Terra Grigia, where incriminating records tied to Lansdale may still be intact. Before he can say more, Lansdale moves quickly to silence him, ordering O'Brien's arrest and cutting him off from all communications. Chris and Jill soon reach the Queen Dido, right where Resident Evil Revelations barrels into its climax. The pair are confronted by the despicable leader of the bioterrorist organization. Jill and Chris are ultimately able to defeat and kill him. Better still, they were able to record footage about Lansdale's full involvement in the Terra Grigia panic. After the fight is done, Chris and Jill broadcast the video, exposing Lansdale. In the aftermath, the FBC head is arrested, while O'Brien is set free, following which he steps down as BSAA's head owing to the part that he played in the Queen Zenobia mission. In its final moments, Resident Evil Revelations still has a couple more reveals up its sleeve. For starters, it turns out that neither Parker nor Raymond Vester were actually dead, with the latter having faked his death and successfully rescued the former before the Queen Zenobia self-destructed. After a month of recovery, in fact, Parker rejoined the BSAA for active duty. Raymond, meanwhile, is revealed to be a double agent, while Jessica Shurawat, who is still very much alive, is a triple agent. Both, it turns out, work for Tricell, a multinational pharmaceutical company. Jessica meets Tricell, where she hands them a vial of the T-Abyss virus. Publicly, Tricell's goal for acquiring the virus is to hold onto it and block it from entering the market, owing to how dangerous it is. But as is often the case with big pharmaceutical companies in the Resident Evil universe, their actual goals are far more sinister. And so what exactly are those goals? Well, we're going to go over that and more when we return for the 13th part of our recap of the Resident Evil series. Here we are at part 13 of our Resident Evil recap, where we're going to cover the events of Resident Evil 5, one of the most significant games as far as the series' overarching story is concerned. Not only does RE5 see the paths of longtime series veterans like Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, and Albert Wesker, it also brings resolution to several major long-running arcs. Now, before we begin, this video is based on our understanding of Resident Evil 5's story and lore, and reflects our interpretation of its events as a refresher before Resident Evil Requiem. As always, we recommend that you make your own informed call by looking into the game yourself and ensuring that it matches your expectations, standards, and personal values. And also, just a heads up before we dive in, this is a newly edited, expanded, and restructured version of our earlier recap, now presented in 4K at 60 FPS. This entire recap series also includes coverage of Outbreak, Outbreak File Number 2, Umbrella Chronicles, and Darkside Chronicles, entries that we didn't include the first time around. Now, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Lost in Nightmares. Resident Evil 5 is set in the year 2009, about 5 years after the events of RE4 Remake, and 4 years after RE Revelations. Though we're actually going to start this recap a little earlier. First, we're going to talk about the RE5 DLC Lost in Nightmares, which is set in 2006, and moves a lot of the pieces into place for some of the main game's most crucial turns. As Lost in Nightmares begins, we see Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine on a BSAA mission, raiding an estate where they believe they are finally going to apprehend Umbrella Corporation's co-founder, Oswell E. Spencer. Since Umbrella's activities were exposed and the company went under, Spencer has, as a wanted man, been in hiding, but the BSAA is now hoping to finally put him in chains to not only answer for his crimes, but also provide important information on Albert Wesker, his plans, and anything else he may know about him. Inside the estate, it's as if time has folded back on itself. Chris and Jill push through a series of terrors that mirror the nightmare that they survived in the Arklay Mountains, as though someone is forcing them to relive the Spencer mansion all over again.
When they finally break into Spencer's office, they don't find the old mastermind waiting for them. They then find a corpse. Spencer's dead, and Albert Wesker is standing over him. Chris and Jill try to take Wesker head on, but it is a losing fight. He dismantles them with ease, and when he's seconds away from killing Chris, Jill steps in, throwing herself at Wesker and sending them both crashing out of a window into a ravine below. No bodies are recovered, but the BSAA declares them dead. Chris, however, refuses to accept that Jill is gone. And with that, Lost in Nightmares wraps up. Chris and Sheva enter the scene. The story jumps ahead 3 years to 2009, where Resident Evil 5 begins with Chris and BSAA operative Sheva Alomar heading to West Africa to investigate bioweapon smuggling. Their main target is Ricardo Irving, a black market arms dealer set to broker a bioweapons transaction, something the BSA cannot allow to go through. Chris and Sheva's first objective is to make contact with BSAA's Alpha team in the Kijuju Autonomous Zone, where they are to receive further intel. But pretty much as soon as they land, they learn that things have already gone spectacularly wrong. Somehow the village that they land in has been completely overrun by people infected with a parasite, who now have to be eliminated. Meanwhile, Alpha Team has also perished, having been completely wiped out by a bizarre and terrifying new bioweapon. What Chris and Sheva don't know yet is that this bioweapon was created by a deadly new virus known as Ouroboros, but we'll get to that in a bit. Eventually, Chris and Sheva cross paths with BSAA's Delta team, which is led by Sheva's former mentor, Josh Stone, who proves to be the source of some crucial new details. He shows them data related to bioterrorist activities in the region, but in that data, Chris also discovers a relatively recent picture of none other than Jill Valentine. Given the fact that she's been presumed dead for 3 years, Chris is more than a little startled, and his theory that his former partner might still be alive begins taking stronger root. For the moment, bigger concerns take priority. The mystery deepens. Chris and Sheva pick the chase back up and nearly manage to corner Ricardo Irving, until a mysterious, hooded figure steps in at the last second and helps him slip away. What follows is a brutal gauntlet of BOW encounters, with Delta Team being almost completely wiped out along the way. When the time comes back to check in with BSA HQ, Chris puts it off. He's becoming convinced Jill isn't just alive, she's somehow tied to everything that's unfolding in West Africa. Getting to the truth and finding her takes precedence over procedure. Sheva recognizes the stakes and chooses to stay with him. Eventually, they catch Irving again, and this time there's no escape route, and no one coming to save him. Cornered, he makes a desperate move and injects himself with the parasite, mutating almost instantly into a grotesque, tentacled monstrosity. Chris and Sheva bring him down, and with his last breaths in human form, Irving points them towards a nearby cave where he claims the answers are waiting. He also names another player behind the operation, Excella Guione, head of Tricell's African division, and a key figure in the bioterror outbreak spreading across the region. When Chris and Sheva get to the cave mentioned by Irving, the duo find the flower named Stairway of the Sun. The flower that, as we covered in part 1 of our recap of the Resident Evil series, was used to extract the progenitor virus, and is, in turn, basically responsible for every messed up virus and bioterror threat that the world has ever been faced with. And that's not all that they find. They also discover an old Umbrella facility, which is now operated by Tricell, and is where the company has been conducting a lot of its twisted experiments. As they push deeper into the facility, Chris and Sheva discover rows of containment pods designed to keep human test subjects imprisoned. One of them stops Chris cold, an empty pod labeled Jill Valentine. They also finally get clarity on what they've been fighting. The outbreaks plaguing West Africa weren't random. They were orchestrated by Tricell's Excella Guione. She isn't acting alone. Excella is working with Albert Wesker, who's very much still alive. Wesker's endgame is Ouroboros. With Excella's support, he plans to launch missiles at multiple targets and spread the virus across the globe. The fallout would be catastrophic, but in Wesker's twisted view, that destruction is the point. He intends to reshape humanity, letting only a superior, new breed rise from the ruins. Jill Valentine. In pursuit of Excella, Chris and Sheva make it out of the lab and proceed through a connected network of caves, only to be stopped in their tracks by Excella herself. and in the company of none other than Albert Wesker, along with the mysterious hooded figure that helped Irving when Chris and Sheva first tried to apprehend him.
And, well, the revelations just keep coming, because it's at this point that it's revealed that the hooded figure is none other than Jill Valentine. Since her presumed death 3 years ago, Jill has been Wesker's captive, during which time she was thoroughly brainwashed and constantly experimented upon. Now she's being mind-controlled by Wesker through a device strapped to her, serving as his unwilling puppet.
NeiCaelum and Wesker flee from the scene, while Jill stays behind to deal with Chris and Sheva and stop them from giving chase. The trio engage in a tense fight, and after much difficulty, Chris and Sheva finally manage to defeat Jill and rip Wesker's device off of her. Slowly, Jill comes back to herself, and incredibly weak though she is, she urges Chris and Sheva to go after Wesker and NeiCaelum, assuring them that she will be okay. A reluctant Chris agrees, and she and Sheva set off again.
The Desperate Escape.
With Chris and Sheva gone, Desperate Escape Story DLC picks up the thread.
Josh finds Jill barely conscious, collapsed on the floor. He pulls her up and tells her that beyond the mountain is a helipad which can be used for extraction. From there, the two cut through the Tricell facility, moving through various challenges while fighting off Magini that swarm the route. As the situation spirals further out of control, Jill remembers something crucial about Wesker and insists on reaching the communications center to get a warning to Chris. Josh sticks with her, since that path also leads them to their only way out. Now keep this in mind as we divert our attentions back to RE5's main story beats.
Wesker and NeiCaelum have fled to a Tricell-owned oil tanker, but Chris and Sheva manage to pursue them aboard.
Battling their way through waves of Ouroboros monstrosities, they finally corner NeiCaelum. The reunion is short-lived. In classic Wesker fashion, he turns on her without hesitation, coldly declaring that she was never anything more than a disposable pawn.
To seal her fate, he injects her with Ouroboros, mutating her into a grotesque abomination that Chris and Sheva are forced to put down.
By the time that NeiCaelum is defeated, Wesker is already moving on to the next phase of his plans. He prepares to launch from the tanker in a bomber, intended to deploy Ouroboros-loaded missiles across the globe.
Chris and Sheva race after him, and it's during this desperate pursuit that Chris receives an unexpected call from Jill.
This is where we switch back to the events of Desperate Escape once again. After 3 years as Wesker's captive, she learned more about him than anyone alive, and the fragments of that knowledge are finally starting to fall into place. She tells Chris that Wesker has to inject himself with a specific dose of a progenitor-based serum in order to make sure his body does not succumb to the soup of many infections that he's pumped into himself over the years. That means the serum, in turn, is also needed to maintain his superpowers. More importantly, according to Jill, if Wesker receives a larger dose than he needs to, the serum will effectively act as a poison, thoroughly weakening him.
NeiCaelum, it turns out, had several vials of that serum, vials that she dropped when she was previously being chased by Chris and Sheva, and vials that, as luck would have it, Sheva smartly scooped up.
However, the transmission between Chris and Jill breaks. Jill and Josh now rush to the helipad to get the hell out of a location that is now being swarmed by zombies. The helicopter, piloted by Doug, finally reaches them, but he's killed by a missile while covering their escape.
Josh pilots the chopper out with Jill, and the two immediately head for Chris and Sheva's location.
Wesker's End.
As Wesker prepares the bomber for takeoff, Chris and Sheva storm the hangar and confront him at the very last second.
A vicious fight erupts, with Wesker once again proving just how evil he's become. Chris manages to inject him with an overdose of the serum, forcing Wesker to break off the fight and retreat into the cockpit.
He lifts off immediately, but not before Chris and Sheva cling on and haul themselves aboard the aircraft.
And the battle continues in midair as the plane roars through the sky. Amid the chaos, Chris lands another injection, weakening Wesker further, yet still failing to put him down. The struggle sends the aircraft spiraling out of control, and moments later it crashes violently into an active volcano.
Climbing free from the burning wreckage, Chris and Sheva are met with a grim realization. Wesker has survived yet again.
Enraged and refusing to accept defeat, he injects himself with an Ouroboros drawn directly from his missile payload, mutating into an even more grotesque and powerful form.
One final battle follows as the volcano begins to erupt around them, the ground crackling and collapsing beneath Wesker's feet. At last, the lava consumes him entirely. Moments later, Jill Valentine and Josh Stone arrive in a BSAA helicopter, pulling Chris and Sheva from the brinks as the volcano continues to tear itself apart behind them. As Chris and Sheva climb aboard, however, the ever-so-stubborn Wesker, which is really putting it mildly, thrusts a massive mutated arm out of the lava and grabs the chopper, preventing it from flying away from the exploding volcano. Desperate to be done with him once and for all, Chris and Sheva fire an RPG into Wesker's face, and this time, they finally kill him. And yes, we know that Wesker has died more times than we can count over the course of the Resident Evil franchise, but this time, he is actually fully dead. And that brings our recap of Resident Evil 5 to an end. When we return in Part 14, we'll be talking about the events of Resident Evil Revelations 2. In Part 13 of our Resident Evil recap, we covered the dramatic events of RE5. But before we subject ourselves to the monstrosity that is Resident Evil 6, here in Part 14 of our full series recap, we're going to talk about the game that serves as a bridge to it, Resident Evil Revelations 2, which also serves as a follow-up to RE5 and of course the first Revelations. Now, before we begin, this video is based on our understanding of Resident Evil Revelations 2's story and lore, and reflects our interpretation of its events as a refresher before Resident Evil Requiem. As always, we recommend that you make your own informed call by looking into the game yourself and ensuring that it matches your expectations, standards, and personal values. And also, just as a heads up before we dive in, this is a newly edited, expanded, and restructured version of our earlier recap, now presented in 4K at 60 FPS. This entire recap series also includes coverage of Outbreak, Outbreak File Number 2, Umbrella Chronicles, and Darkside Chronicles, entries that we did not include the first time around. So with that out of the way, let's get started. The setting. Revelations 2 is set in the year 2011, a couple of years after the events of Resident Evil 5 and the death of Albert Wesker, and features two primary playable protagonists, Claire Redfield, who returns for her third outing after RE2 and Code Veronica, and longtime fan favorite Barry Burton, Chris and Jill's former star's comrade who steps into the limelight as a playable character for the first time in a Resident Evil game. Resident Evil Revelations 2 splits its story across 4 chapters, with Claire and Barry sharing the stage, though the latter's part of the story is set about 6 months after Claire's. For the purposes of this recap, however, we're going to be going over the game's events in chronological order and not in the time-jumping manner that the game presents them in. So with that said, let's dive right in. Resident Evil Revelations 2 opens with Claire Redfield, now working for the anti-bioterror organization, TerraSave, attending a TerraSave event with her new partner, Moira Burton, the daughter of Barry Burton. Compared to the experienced Claire, Moira seems inexperienced and unsure, but she carries a heavy past. Years earlier, she and her sister Polly discovered one of their father's guns, and while handling it carelessly, Moira accidentally shot and seriously injured her sister. Barry initially blamed Moira for the event, creating deep tension between them, though he later accepted that the real fault was his for allowing the weapon to even be accessible. Even so, the trauma never left Moira, and in the present day she lives with a deep fear of firearms. The TerraSave gathering that Claire and Moira are attending as Revelations 2 kicks off is interrupted by an abrupt and unexpected attack. Armed and masked soldiers come crashing in and quickly proceed to knock out those in attendance and take them away as captives. When Claire and Moira come to, they realize that they're in an abandoned, decrepit prison on an island. And that's far from the end of their predicament. The prison you see is also crawling with terrifying creatures known as the Afflicted, once regular humans who, under the pressure of extreme torture over time, have completely broken and mutated. The nightmare begins. When Claire and Moira come to, they discover strange bracelets locked around their wrists. The devices allow them to communicate, but they also serve a far more disturbing function. A woman calling herself the Overseer contacts them through the bracelets and calmly explains that the prison they are trapped in is under her control. The bracelets, she reveals, monitor and record their fear. The reason becomes clear later. After fighting their way through the prison and eventually reaching an abandoned settlement, Claire and Moira learn the truth. They're not random captives, but deliberate test subjects. The Overseer is developing a new bioweapon known as the T-Phobos virus, a strain that reacts to fear. Once an inflicted person reaches a critical emotional threshold, the virus triggers, transforming them into a mutated creature. They've barely had time to process it when they link up with their co-workers, Gabriel Chavez and Pedro Fernandez. Gabe spots a busted helicopter and drags Claire over. His plan is simple: fix it, fly out, survive. Well, it doesn't last. Around this point, the group is attacked by the afflicted, and Pedro, unable to keep his fear in check, mutates into a monster. They fight off against Pedro until the TerraSave's leader, Neil Fisher, arrives to help them escape. Not long afterward, they cross paths with another mysterious figure, a young girl named Natalia, an orphan who lost her parents in the Terra Grigia panic years ago, who thanks to the many traumas she has been through is now effectively immune to fear. At the same time, Gabe finally gets the helicopter running and makes a break for it, only for the Overseer to take control from afar. She cripples the flight systems mid-escape, and Gabe is killed in the crash. Claire's meeting with the young girl is cut short due to the crash, however, because she is soon abducted by a hooded figure who takes her back to the Overseer. And what does the Overseer want with her? Well, she wants to transfer her mind and consciousness into Natalia, effectively rendering herself immortal. And it's at this point that Resident Evil Revelations 2 starts doling out answers for the many mysteries that it's built up. The Revelations. As Claire and Moira pursue Natalia and the person who took her, the bigger picture starts coming into focus. The Overseer is revealed to be Alex Wesker, tied directly to the same Project Wesker that produced Albert. He was the most infamous result, but not the only one. Alex, raised and shaped by that program, went on to become an Umbrella researcher, and she has been continuing her work in the shadows ever since. They also learn that she's not operating alone. Neil Fisher, a former FBC operative, has aligned himself with her. After the FBC was dissolved when Morgan Lansdale's connection to the Terra Grigia panic came to light, Fisher became obsessed with rebuilding the organization and putting himself at the center of it. His partnership with Alex is transactional. He helps advance her experiments, and in return, he wants a sample of Ouroboros, believing it can be the leverage he needs to resurrect the FBC and turn it into something even more formidable. But Alex Wesker is a Wesker after all, and that's something that Fisher has clearly failed to consider. Alex betrays him, and as soon as Fisher, who is the hooded figure that abducted Natalia, hands the little girl over to Alex, rather than handing him an Ouroboros sample, Alex injects him with the virus and flees from the scene. Fisher reacts to Ouroboros instantly and is turned into a monster that Claire and Moira are then forced to deal with. The fight culminates in Moira finally getting over her fear of guns and killing Fisher for good. Claire and Moira are not out of danger yet. They track Alex down, only to find that she has Natalia in her grasp. When they finally confront her, Alex lays out the endgame. She intends to overwrite Natalia with her own consciousness, using the girl as a vessel to cheat fear and even death itself. Then, without warning, Alex raises her gun and shoots herself in the head. By every visible measure, she is dead. Alex's death sets the facility into lockdown and triggers a self-destruct sequence, forcing Claire and Moira to sprint for their lives. They almost make it out together, but the escape collapses at the worst possible moment. Moira is pinned beneath falling debris and cannot free herself. She begs Claire to go, and Claire, with no other choice, dives into the ocean and barely survives. When she wakes up, Claire is in a hospital, and Barry Burton is there waiting. She breaks the news that Moira did not make it, but Barry, devastated, cannot bring himself to accept it. 6 months later. Here we're going to move on to Barry Burton's side of the story, which is set half of a year after the events that we just recounted. Looking for his daughter, Barry arrives on the island where she and Claire were trapped 6 months ago, and it's not long afterward that he too crosses paths with Natalia. But before this meeting, there are some important details that you need to know. Just before Barry reaches her, Natalia slips into a dreamlike sequence and sees Lottie, her favorite teddy bear. When Lottie vanishes, she searches the island, now crawling with danger but guided by Dark Natalia, a manifestation of Alex's mind that can sense nearby monsters and help her sneak through them. She eventually reaches the seashore, where Dark Natalia tries to take over Natalia's body, warning she'll be overwritten eventually. Natalia awakens from her as Barry's boat approaches the island. Barry, not wanting to leave the little girl on her own in such a hostile place, decides to look after her and travel with her. The two brave all manner of obstacles and dangers as they trek through the island, and also make a rather unsurprising discovery that Alex Wesker isn't dead after all, and thanks to the T-Phobos virus has transformed her into a monster. Encounter against Alex. Barry and Natalia's journey culminates, as you'd expect, in a final confrontation with Alex Wesker, which can go one of multiple ways, but for the purposes of this recap, we're going to focus only on the canon path. Alex injects herself with Ouroboros, living up to her name, and mutates even further. As the fight proceeds, the mutated Alex proves to be too much for Barry to handle, which is saying a lot. But just when it seems like he's going to get beaten and Natalia is going to go back into Alex's crutches, Moira arrives on the scene. Yes, she is still alive and has been surviving on the island for the past 6 months. But how did she survive? During the 6 months between Claire's escape and Barry's arrival, Moira survives alongside Evgeny Rebek, an elderly Russian who saved her when the tower was destroyed. They would often clash against each other, but after finding a letter from Evgeny's daughter and learning her fate, he gives up and gives in to his illness and urging Moira to leave, so she pushes on and makes it in time to save Barry and Natalia from Alex. With Moira's help, Barry and Natalia are able to fight off Alex, with the three of them making a run for it right afterwards. Alex refuses to stay down. She mutates again and hunts them through the ruins, forcing Barry, Moira, and Natalia in a desperate final push for survival. Help arrives at the last moment when Claire returns to the island in a helicopter and covers them from above with a sniper rifle, buying them the seconds that they need to reach the extraction point. As the three scramble aboard, Alex makes one last charge in her fully transformed state. Claire answers it with an RPG shot that obliterates her for good, a deliberate echo of the moment years earlier when Claire's brother Chris ended Albert Wesker the same way with a final rocket. In the epilogue, Claire heads to Barry's place and learns her brother Chris Redfield is in China to fight off against the C virus, something we're going to tackle in RE6. Without missing a beat, she says, tell Piers to keep an eye on him. But Weskers will always be Weskers, and it seems like Alex hasn't been fully dealt with yet. Resident Evil Revelation 2's epilogue reveals that Barry has adopted Natalia and is now raising her as his daughter, though it also turns out that Alex Wesker's plan of transferring her consciousness into Natalia may have worked after all, with the woman's mind seemingly beginning to overtake the young girl's. Well, for now, that's the last that we see of Alex Wesker and Natalia, and we don't really know how long it'll be before the developer chooses to follow up on that story. There is still plenty more to talk about where the larger Resident Evil plotline is concerned, however, because when we return for part 15 of our series' recap, we're going to be talking about the messy, convoluted events of Resident Evil 6. Okay, deep breath. We are on part 15 of our recap of the Resident Evil series, and here we're going to talk about the colossal mess that is Resident Evil 6. Now, don't get us wrong, there are things to like about the game. Primary among them being the fact that it is straight up just a really fun action game and a great co-op experience, though that does come at the cost of the series' horror roots. But where its story is concerned, RE6 is nothing short of a complete mess. We are, however, going to do our best to present it as cohesively as possible. Oh, and by the way, RE6 is basically a loud side story. Big action, low impact on the overall plot. So if you're here for the main timeline or don't vibe with its style, skipping it is totally reasonable. Before we begin, this video is based on our understanding of Resident Evil 6's story and lore, and reflects our interpretation of its events as a refresher before Resident Evil Requiem. As always, we recommend that you make your own informed call by looking into the game yourself and ensuring that it matches your expectations, standards, and personal values. And also, just as a heads up before we dive in, this is a newly edited, expanded, and restructured version of our earlier recap, now presented in 4K at 60 FPS. This entire recap series also includes coverage of Outbreak, Outbreak File Number 2, Umbrella Chronicles, and Darkside Chronicles, entries that we didn't include the first time around. Now with that out of the way, let's get started. The setting. Resident Evil 6 tells its story across 4 separate campaigns and multiple central protagonists, featuring a mix of both new and returning faces. And though most of the game takes place in the year 2013, our story begins 6 months earlier in late 2012. Chris and his squad infiltrate a Neo Umbrella facility, though things don't exactly go to plan. They're accosted by the mysterious woman who looks like Ada Wong, and we'll just call her Fake Ada for now, who infects almost everyone present with the C virus before she flees. Chris and Piers are the only ones in their squad who don't get infected, though they are forced to gun down their fellow BSAA soldiers after they succumb to the virus. Chris also sustains heavy injuries, and it's only thanks to Piers' efforts that the two manage to survive and escape. Is this really Ada? Let's go and pause here and reveal a significant piece of information that Resident Evil 6 doesn't reveal until much later. Just to make things a little less messy and confusing. Because let's face it, this is RE6, and this is going to be messy and confusing enough as it is. The woman we're referring to as Fake Ada is actually Carla Radamez, Neo Umbrella's lead researcher, and she works in secret for a man named Derek Simmons, who is the United States President's National Security Advisor. There is a deeper conversation to be had about Simmons and what he's trying to achieve, but for now, here's the simplified version of the Carla Radamez and Ada Wong situation. Simmons has long been obsessed with Ada Wong, and that fixation eventually curdles into something far more extreme. When he cannot possess Ada herself, he decides to create a replacement. He takes Carla Radamez and forcefully reshapes her into a counterfeit Ada by injecting her with a C virus-based treatment mixed with Ada's DNA. And from that point on, Carla is the one moving through the world wearing Ada's face. Meanwhile, after the disaster in Edonia, Chris withdraws into self-imposed exile and becomes convinced that Ada is the reason most of his squad is dead. Leon Kennedy returns. Now we jump forward 6 months in time to midway through 2013, and our attention turns to Leon S. Kennedy, who is now working as an agent for the DSO and is currently, alongside U.S. Secret Service agent Helena Harper, providing personal security for Adam Binford, the President of the United States. Binford, you see, intends to soon publicly release all previously classified information related to the Raccoon City crisis years ago, as part of his efforts against global bioterrorism. As you might imagine, however, there are other forces at work who do not want this to happen. Tall Oaks, the city where Leon, Helena, and the President find themselves at the beginning of this story in Resident Evil 6, becomes ground zero for a bioterror attack. The C virus is unleashed all over the city, turning people into zombified monsters, including the President himself. As the zombified President attempts to attack Helena, Leon is forced to shoot and kill him. Following which, Helena tells Leon that she has something crucial to show him at Tall Oaks that will answer some of his questions about their current predicament. Helena finally tells Leon what she's been hiding, and it's bigger than either of them expected. She claims Derek Simmons orchestrated the C virus attacks on Tall Oaks and is directly tied to the President's death. She also insists that he was behind Raccoon City's destruction in 1998, and warns that what he's planning now will dwarf anything that happened there. Helena's proof is personal. Simmons has her sister, Deborah, and he's using her as leverage to keep Helena obedient. Deborah, she says, is being held in a concealed lab beneath Tall Oaks, and Helena wants Leon to go there with her, but the rescue turns into a nightmare. They arrive too late, and Deborah has already been warped by repeated experiments into a grotesque creature. Leon and Helena are forced to fight her and ultimately put her down. In the middle of that chaos, Ada Wong shows up, the real Ada and not the impersonator, and makes it clear that she's pursuing her own target, Carla Radamez, and the false Ada plot that Simmons set in motion. Ada also fills Leon in on Simmons' reach, revealing that he's part of the family, a secretive power block that has been manipulating events for years. By then, Simmons had already pinned the President's death on Leon and Helena in public, then adds insult to injury by offering to help clear the names if they surrender. Leon and Helena obviously do not fall for that though, and with the help of US agent Ingrid Hunnigan, they fake their deaths. The two head to Langxing, China, where it seems Simmons has orchestrated another bioterror attack in the form of a C virus outbreak. Meanwhile, Tall Oaks is destroyed into oblivion behind them, calling back to the destruction of Raccoon City. Chris Redfield's nightmares. Here, we pause and switch our attention back to Chris Redfield, who is in awful shape to say the least. Since losing his team in Edonia 6 months ago, Chris has gone into a self-imposed exile, and on top of that is suffering from PTSD and amnesia. Piers arrives on the scene, however, and informs Chris that there's a new bioterror threat in China that needs to be dealt with.
Though initially reluctant to step back into the fray, Chris ultimately relents and agrees to travel to Langxing with Piers, stepping back into active duty for the BSAA, and he also recovers from amnesia. Don't ask me how. In Langxing, Jake and Sherry finally break out after 6 months in Neo Umbrella custody, only to stumble into Leon and Helena, while everyone is being hunted by Neo Umbrella troops. They trade information fast, with Leon and Helena confirming Simmons is the architect behind the disaster and pointing Jake and Sherry towards where he can be found before splitting up again. Soon after, Leon and Helena run into Carla Radamez. Then they try to corner her for answers, but Chris and Piers storm in and the situation implodes. Chris, still convinced he's staring at Ada, nearly executes her on the spot for what happened in Edonia, while Leon stops him because Carla is their best lead to reach Simmons. Tempers explode, guns come up, and in the standoff, Carla slips away. Leon manages to pull Chris back from the edge and makes him see the real target, and they agree to divide and conquer, with Leon and Helena pursuing Simmons while Chris and Piers go after Carla. Leon and Helena reach Simmons just as Jake and Sherry do, and the confrontation detonates exactly the way that you would expect. After delivering his grand speech about order and stability, Simmons, already infected with the C virus, mutates into a massive monster with a dinosaur-like silhouette. Jake and Sherry try to peel away, but they're overwhelmed and captured again by Neo Umbrella forces, while Leon and Helena stay behind to bring Simmons down. They manage to beat him back, but it's clear that the fight is not truly over. Carla's end. Chris and Piers, who are still chasing after Carla and think she's Ada, have managed to find her and corner her aboard an aircraft carrier, and when they finally confront her face to face, she reveals the full extent of her plan. It seems she is no longer working to fulfill Simmons' ambitions, but her own. After having been tortured for years by Simmons and turned into an Ada Wong clone, Carla's own personality is reawakening again, and now she wants nothing more than to destroy Simmons and the family. Her plan to do so, however, involves firing a missile containing the C virus over Langxing, which will trigger a global outbreak, plunging the world into chaos. Conveniently enough, or inconveniently at this point, Carla is shot by a sniper aboard a helicopter who's working for the family. She falls off the aircraft carrier to her seeming death. No, she's not dead, later, killed by Ada. But even so, her C-virus missile activates and launches, exploding in the sky and enveloping the city in C-virus-infused gas. Chris gets in touch with Leon to compare notes. Leon tries to reassure him that the situation is still salvageable and claims that they have brought down the massive Simmons mutation, even if that turns out to be premature. Chris, meanwhile, warns that a missile strike is imminent and that Langxing needs to be evacuated immediately. Leon then fills him in on Jake, explaining that his immunity makes him the key to synthesizing a C-virus vaccine. But Jake is still a Neo Umbrella captive, so the plan is set on the spot. Piers' ultimate sacrifice. Chris and Piers will hit a nearby Neo Umbrella undersea facility to extract Jake and Sherry, while Leon and Helena attempt to get out of the city. Leon and Helena's escape is cut off when Simmons returns yet again, refusing to stay dead. They fight him one final time, and with the help of the real Ada Wong, they manage to kill him for good. Ada disappears as quickly as she arrives, tracks down Carla's research, and destroys it completely before slipping out of the city in the same direction as Leon and Helena. At the undersea facility, Chris and Piers locate Jake and Sherry, and the tension between Jake and Chris is obvious given Chris killed Jake's father. Before they can fully get away, everything goes sideways. They're attacked by House, a towering C-virus infected creature created by Carla Radamez, capable of propagating and spreading the virus on its own. Knowing it cannot be allowed to reach the surface, Chris and Piers stay behind to fight House, buying Jake and Sherry the time that they need to escape. Chris and Piers' fight against House proves to be a grueling challenge for both of them, to the extent that at one point, they're both on the verge of being killed by the creature. Seeing no other way out, Piers injects himself with the C-virus, and after transforming and mutating as a result, is able to use his new power to defeat House. He knows, however, that now that he's been infected, it won't be too long before he fully loses control of himself, and so he forces Chris to escape the facility in a pod. As he leaves the facility in a pod, a helpless Chris watches on as Piers commits the ultimate act of sacrifice and destroys the facility with him still in it. Before the facility is destroyed, Jake and Sherry do narrowly manage to escape as well,
but only after a final battle with the relentless Ustanak. After the fight, Jake hands Sherry a sample of his blood and leaves. A vaccine is successfully synthesized using Jake's blood, and the C-virus threat is slowly but surely dealt with. And do Chris and Leon know that Carlo was a fake? Well, yes, by the end. They understand the Ada that they were chasing wasn't the real Ada at all, but an imposter. And that's it. That's the story of Resident Evil 6. Is it cohesive? No. Does it make much sense? Not really. Does it add to the larger Resident Evil canon? Effectively not, especially since the developer has since abandoned most of the plot threads that were introduced here, and probably for good reason. Let's just hope that whenever this mess is remade, the developer is able to bring it in line with the other games in the series. But either way, that's the full story of Resident Evil 6, such as it is. When we return for part 16 of our full Resident Evil recap, we're going to get back to the good stuff, because up next is Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. After the inexcusable mess that was Resident Evil 6's story, we all deserve something much, much better at this point, and luckily for us, next up is Resident Evil 7, which, well, to say the very least, is definitely much, much better. The 2017 survival horror title reinvented the franchise and served as a soft reboot, though it was still following up on the established RE universe rather than wiping the slate clean. It was also a bit of a clean break with a completely new story focused on new characters and without any of the baggage of prior titles weighing things down. That, of course, means that for once, we don't have a ton of backstory to go through before we jump right into the thick of things. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Without further ado, here's the full story of Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. The setting. RE7 is set in the year 2017, and unusually, serving as its protagonist isn't an established character with years of experience fighting against nightmarish monsters, but instead a regular, vanilla everyman in the form of Ethan Winters. 3 years ago, Ethan's wife Mia left on what was supposedly just a regular babysitting job, but it wasn't long afterwards that she disappeared entirely off the face of the planet and was presumed dead. As RE7 kicks off though, Ethan receives a message from her. Apparently she is still alive, and wants him to get her at a place called the Baker Residence, deep in the swamps of Dulve, Louisiana. Desperate to find his wife, Ethan heads over to Dulve immediately, but upon arriving at the Baker Residence, he quickly realizes that things are about to take a grisly turn. Almost instantly, he's welcomed by corpses of animals, both whole and in pieces, all over the place, as well as a rundown and decaying mansion that looks like it's been plucked out of a horror movie. With trepidation, Ethan explores the house, and it doesn't take long for him to successfully locate Mia, who, much to his shock and relief, is still alive, but unfortunately is far from well. Mia feels distant and unrecognizable, drifting in and out of awareness as she rambles to Ethan about things that make no sense. Her words sound detached from reality, as though she's trapped in some nightmare that he cannot see. Then, without warning, her behavior shifts from unsettling to outright terrifying. She attacks him with shocking force, moving with strength that seems impossible. Ethan tries to defend himself, but the encounter turns savage. She drives a screwdriver through his hand, slams him into walls, and relentlessly pursues him throughout the house. When he attempts to fight back, the violence only escalates. In the chaos, Ethan is forced to pull the trigger. When Mia finally collapses, the reality of what he's done hits him immediately, and regret washes over him almost at once. He barely has a moment to process any of it. An elderly man suddenly ambushes him, greets him with a chilling welcome to the family, and knocks him unconscious with a single brute punch. Things take an ever more horrifying turn when Ethan then comes to. The horror intensifies. When he wakes up, he finds himself tied to a chair and sitting at a dinner table, with his decapitated hand somehow having been reattached. And he's not alone. Also sitting at the table is almost the entirety of the Baker family. Jack Baker, who is the old man who punched and knocked out Ethan earlier, Jack's wife, Marguerite, their son, Lucas, and an old woman in a wheelchair. Horrifyingly, the Bakers seem to be enjoying a meal of human flesh and guts, and are more than a little insistent that Ethan partakes as well. The nightmarish scene is cut short, however, when the house's doorbell rings and the Bakers all leave the scene to investigate. The chaos gives Ethan a narrow window to run. He pushes deeper into the house, desperate to find any possible exit from the nightmare that he stumbled into. Not long after, a landline phone rings. On the other end is Zoe Baker. Unlike the rest of the family, she sounds calm and lucid. Zoe explains that the Bakers have been infected by a new strain of virus that's warped their minds and granted them disturbing regenerative abilities. The infection has spread beyond just the family. A thick black mold has overtaken the estate itself, creeping along walls and floors, while grotesque creatures formed from the same substance roam the corridors. These beings are called the Molded, and they hunt anything that moves. Zoe insists that there is still hope. A serum exists that can neutralize the mold's effects, but it must be created first. The necessary ingredients are scattered across the property, meaning Ethan will have to search the estate to gather them. Once completed, the old serum could cure Zoe and Mia. And yes, Mia survived and she remains infected. With no better option and everything to lose, Ethan agrees. If synthesizing the serum offers even a chance to save Mia and escape the Baker estate, it is a risk he's willing to take. Ethan spends a significant chunk of Resident Evil 7 from that point exploring the Baker residence in his attempt to find the components for the serum. And in that time, he comes up against not only scores of the Molded, but Jack Baker as well. Empowered and malformed by the virus, Jack proves to be more than a formidable foe in each fight. And though each time Ethan manages to survive and defeat his adversary, Jack just keeps coming back, stronger and more deformed than before. In a nutshell, he seems unkillable. Tracking down the serum ingredients forces Ethan into another deadly confrontation, this time with Marguerite Baker. The infection has twisted her into something monstrous, granting her control over swarms of enormous insects that pour from the walls and the ceilings at her command. The fight is exhausting and vicious, but Ethan ultimately brings her down. With Marguerite dead, he finally secures the remaining components required to create the serum. Before he can act on that progress, Lucas intervenes. He abducts both Zoe and Mia and forces Ethan into a sadistic gauntlet designed like a nightmarish escape room, packed with lethal traps and cruel puzzles. Ethan barely survives the ordeal, managing to push through each obstacle, but Lucas slips away before a final confrontation can happen. As if that was not enough, Jack Baker returns in a grotesque, heavily mutated form. The battle that follows is even more desperate than before. With no other option, Ethan uses one of the two completed serums on Jack, seemingly ending him for good. The threat is finally neutralized, but the victory comes at a cost. Ethan now holds only a single remaining dose of the serum. The big decision. It's at this point that Ethan finally meets with both Mia and Zoe, and players are presented with a choice. Use the serum to cure either Mia or Zoe. We are, of course, going to stick with the canon choice for the purposes of this recap, and of course, the canon choice is to use the serum on Mia. After all, finding and rescuing his wife is why Ethan is here in Dulve in the first place. After administering the serum, Ethan climbs into a small boat with Mia, tells Zoe that he's going to send help back for her, and leaves with his wife. Their escape, however, does not go as planned. Things rarely do in the Resident Evil universe. Ethan and Mia's boat chances upon the wreckage of a tanker named the Annabelle in the swamps, and they're attacked by the Molded once again. Their boat is destroyed, the two of them wash up on the ship's wreckage, and Ethan is taken captive by the Molded. At this point, the game shifts perspective, putting players in Mia's boots, and here, Resident Evil 7 finally begins offering answers for some of its biggest mysteries, because as Mia explores the ship in search for Ethan, her memories start returning to her, with the fog of the last 3 years and her mold infection finally beginning to clear. The truth. Mia is not just some unlucky civilian who got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Behind Ethan's back, she had a very different life. She is a trained operative, working for a covert group called the Connections. Like so many clandestine factions in the Resident Evil world, they are deeply invested in developing bioweapons. At some point, the Connections engineered a new kind of weapon, one that could produce the black mold and the creatures born from it, while also exerting psychological control over its targets. To make the asset easier to move and less suspicious, they packaged it in the form of a little girl. The designation was E001. The name was Evelyn. Evelyn, however, was never a clean success. Keeping her looking like a normal child required constant chemical maintenance, and her mind was dangerously unstable. She fixated on the idea of having a family and did not simply want one in the emotional sense. She wanted one in the literal sense. forcing bonds and obedience through her abilities whenever reality did not match her fantasy. And that's where Mia's disappearance really begins. The job Ethan believed was a routine assignment from years earlier was anything but. Mia, along with another Connections agent, was assigned to escort Evelyn to a concealed lab in Central America aboard a ship called the Annabelle. The plan fell apart during a hurricane. In the middle of a storm, Evelyn's powers erupted. The crew was wiped out, leaving only Evelyn and Mia alive, because Mia was the one person Evelyn refused to let go. Evelyn did not want her dead. She wanted her to be Mom. The madness back home. The ship crashed in the swamps of Dulve, Louisiana, the same ship that Ethan and Mia just chanced upon, where Evelyn and Mia were found by the Baker family. Completely unsuspecting of Evelyn's true nature, the Bakers took Evelyn and Mia in, only for Evelyn to turn her powers on the family, driving them to insanity and forcing mutations in their bodies. So what happened? We learn about these events in the Daughters DLC. When Jack puts Evelyn in Lucas's room and sends Zoe Baker for clothes, then lightning kills the power and the girl is suddenly gone. Zoe searches and finds Marguerite Baker rambling in the bathroom until she turns vicious and Jack has to control her. When Zoe comes back with rope, Jack is trying to drown Marguerite, then stabs himself like it's nothing before dragging Lucas Baker away. Marguerite claims voices in her head and gives Zoe the vehicle keys for escape and finds Mia lying. Beside her is a letter which tells her the truth about Evelyn. As soon as she turns around, she sees Evelyn in horror, leading her to lose her consciousness. She finds herself at the dining table as if nothing happened, as Evelyn calls her sister. Due to her knowledge about Evelyn, Zoe was able to resist her control and spent a long time witnessing her family's descent into complete chaos. And how crazy was this family really? Well, this is explained in the banned footage DLC. Clancy Jarvis, the American documentary Sewer Gators cameraman from RE7's VHS tapes, steps into the Baker nightmare when Andre Strickland and Peter Walken bring the crew to the estate in June 2017, expecting a haunted house shoot, but coming across Jack Baker instead. Andre and Peter are killed, while Clancy is dragged into the processing pit behind the main house. The nightmare tape scene is his first test, a long holdout where he scavenges guns, scrap, and tries to survive Jack and swarms of molded until morning. It doesn't matter. Marguerite snatches him soon after, cages him in the master bedroom, and keeps returning with mold-laced meals meant to turn him. In the bedroom tape, Clancy finally breaks the loop by stabbing her in the neck and slipping out through a concealed passage beneath the bed. Lucas ends the escape immediately, knocking him out and chaining his hand to a finger guillotine across from a sack-headed captive he calls Hoffman. The 21 tape sees Clancy forced by Lucas through a series of games that escalates from finger losses to rising electric shocks to a closing buzzsaw, with Lucas even puppeteering Hoffman's body to prolong the game until Clancy survives and Hoffman is killed. Lucas, amused rather than finished, drags Clancy off for more games. And the main story tapes later confirm that he ultimately dies in one of Lucas's barn death traps. Anyways, back to the main topic at hand. Over time, Evelyn was able to stabilize her physical form without the need of her regular chemical doses, but by the time that happened, she had rapidly aged to the point of needing a wheelchair to move around and looking like a feeble old woman, the same one that Ethan saw at the dinner table earlier in the game. Lucas, the uninfected. Interestingly, out of the entire Baker family, the one who is uninfected is Lucas. You see, at a certain point after Evelyn's arrival at the Baker residence, unbeknownst to Evelyn, Lucas was contacted by the Connections, who immunized him and brought him aboard in exchange for him observing Evelyn and providing data on her. But we'll get back to Lucas in a bit. For now, let's focus on Ethan and Mia. The latter makes her way through the wrecked ship, finding a tissue sample of Evelyn, and ultimately succeeds in finding and rescuing Ethan. Handing him Evelyn's tissue sample, she tells her husband that with its help, he can compose a necrotoxin that can be used to defeat and kill Evelyn. Mia chooses to stay behind and combat Evelyn's ongoing attempts to control her mind, while Ethan decides to head back to the Baker residence to deal with the bioweapon once and for all. Chris Redfield returns. Ethan's final confrontation with Evelyn ends with him landing the injection of the necrotoxin, but she refuses to go down quietly. In a last violent surge, she mutates into an enormous mold-borne abomination, a mass so vast it seems to swallow the Baker estate whole. Ethan is completely outmatched until a helicopter arrives at the last possible moment, deploying soldiers who help him finish the fight and bring Evelyn down for good. The twist is who is leading that team. It is Chris Redfield, a veteran agent of the BSAA. Once Evelyn is destroyed, Ethan is pulled to safety and brought aboard the chopper, where he finds Mia alive as well. With the nightmare finally behind him, the helicopter lifts off and the two escape Dulve together. That closes the main story of Resident Evil 7, but the DLC expands what happens next. Not a Hero shifts the focus to Chris. Several years after the events of Resident Evil 6, he's still operating as a BSAA agent, but the Dulve mission has him working alongside a new group called Blue Umbrella. It's a private military outfit created to contain bioterror incidents and clean up the fallout tied to Umbrella's legacy. Chris is there for one primary target, Lucas Baker. The goal is to capture and interrogate him, uncover more about the connections, and shut down the operation behind Evelyn. Lucas complicates everything by cutting ties with everyone and planning to auction off his mold research to the highest bidder. By the time Chris corners him, Lucas is already close to closing a deal with an unknown buyer. Chris does not let that happen. He tracks Lucas down and kills him before the sale can even be completed. Zoe's fate. Meanwhile, there's End of Zoe, which, as its name suggests, focuses on Zoe Baker, who is found and rescued in the swamps by Joe Baker, Jack's brother, who's been living the life of a hermit in the swamps, and has as much managed to escape the infection that tore the Baker family apart. End of Zoe sees Joe's attempts to cure and help Zoe, while also going up against and finally killing Jack Baker, who's not only still alive, but is also mutated further still into a creature known as the Swamp Man. True to his promise, Ethan reveals to Chris about helping Zoe. Chris reaches her, and Zoe thanks Ethan for keeping his word. And that's the full story of Resident Evil 7. When we return for part 17 of our full Resident Evil recap, we're going to talk about Resident Evil Village, which continues the story of the Winters family. Here we are at last, at the final part of our full recap of the Resident Evil series, where we're going to be covering the events of its last new release, Resident Evil 8 Village, and its DLC Shadow of Rose, which together conclude the story of the Winters family. The setting. Resident Evil Village is set in the year 2021. A few years have passed since the Baker residence incident in Dulve, Louisiana, and Ethan and Mia are living a fairly ordinary life, or, well, they're trying to at the very least. Together, they have a daughter, a baby named Rose. But the traumatic incident of the Baker residence have understandably left their scars on both Ethan and Mia. Meanwhile, for their own protection, the Winters family have been living in witness protection for the last 3 years under the ever-watchful eye of the BSAA, from whom he has also received some military training, in a remote house in Eastern Europe, which means they're basically entirely cut off and isolated from the outside world. That isolation, in fact, is doubly important because the Baker incident never became public, with the story that the larger world believes being a tragic gas leak and explosion. As Resident Evil Village begins, it becomes clear that Ethan and Mia's attempt at a peaceful life is not going well, and events spiral out of control with shocking speed. One evening, what should have been a quiet dinner is violently interrupted by a squad of armed operatives. They are members of the BSAA's Hound Wolf Squad, led by Chris Redfield, the same man who once rescued Ethan and Mia from the Baker incident in 2017. This time, however, his role is far more unsettling. In front of Ethan's eyes, Chris shoots and kills Mia. Ethan is swiftly overpowered and taken captive, and baby Rose is taken as well. The nightmare only deepens from there. When Ethan regains consciousness, he finds himself inside the overturned transport truck. The convoy has been attacked. Bodies of BSAA soldiers lie scattered around. Chris is nowhere to be found, and Rose is missing. Driven by fear and desperation, Ethan presses forward into the dark in search of his daughter. He soon arrives at a remote village, buried in snow and surrounded by towering mountains. It quickly becomes apparent that navigating this place and locating Rose would be anything but simple. The settlement appears largely abandoned, and terrifying wolf-like creatures known as lycans roam the area. Ethan is forced into brutal and frantic battles just to survive. Eventually, he encounters a small group of remaining villagers who have managed to stay alive. Although their survival proves short-lived, Ethan is able to gather crucial information about the village and his situation before they meet their grim fates. The Four Lords. Ethan learns that a woman known as Miranda rules over the village, and she does so through 4 different lords who oversee different parts of the village for her. The 4 lords are Alcina Dimitrescu, who rules from the imposing castle that towers over the village, Karl Heisenberg, a mechanical genius who runs a factory on the outskirts, Donna Beneviento, and Salvatore Moreau, who oversees the village's reservoir. And yes, as you would expect from Resident Evil villains, each of the 4 lords also boasts unique powers that they use to maintain control over the village and to do Miranda's bidding. Alcina Dimitrescu is essentially a vampiric figure with immense physical power and eerie, unnatural abilities. Karl Heisenberg can manipulate electromagnetism, and he's also building a force of violent, mechanical creations inside of his factory. Salvatore Moreau is unstable and deeply traumatized, but he can mutate into a gigantic, grotesque creature with a fish-like form. Donna Beneviento, meanwhile, is a haunting presence who uses the unusual flowers growing across her estate to release hallucinogenic substances into the air, trapping her victims in terrifying visions that feel painfully real. Ethan soon discovers that Rose is likely being kept somewhere within Lady Dimitrescu's castle, so he immediately heads there. Before he can reach it, however, he's intercepted by one of the 4 lords, Karl Heisenberg. Heisenberg demonstrates the sheer force of his powers and knocks Ethan unconscious almost instantly. When Ethan wakes up, he's restrained in a cavern, surrounded by the 4 lords, Mother Miranda, and a crowd of Lycans, all staring down at him while they argue about what should be done next. Miranda ultimately allows Heisenberg to proceed, turning Ethan's situation into a cruel spectacle. Ethan is forced into a deadly gauntlet filled with lethal traps, punishing hazards, and relentless attacks from Lycans, all designed for their amusement. Even so, Ethan survives the ordeal, catching Heisenberg off guard and manages to escape. With no time to waste, he resumes his journey to the castle. Along the way, he meets the Duke, an eccentric merchant who supplies Ethan with weapons, upgrades, and other essentials throughout his journey. In their first conversation, the Duke confirms that Rose is indeed somewhere inside of the castle, which only strengthens Ethan's resolve as he pushes forward. But, as you may have expected, the castle proves to be another massive hurdle. As he makes his way through the labyrinthine fortress, he's constantly chased by the towering, terrifying Lady Dimitrescu, as well as 3 younger women with witchy powers that Lady D refers to as her daughters. At one point, Ethan also has one of his hands chopped off by Lady Dimitrescu, just as a mold-infected Mia did in the beginning of RE7, though Ethan is able to reattach it with a simple splash of first aid fluid. And we're going to talk more about that later and how it makes any sort of sense. Ethan eliminates Dimitrescu's daughters one after another, and their deaths push Lady Dimitrescu to abandon caution and hunt him down personally. This is in direct conflict with Miranda's orders, since Dimitrescu has been told to keep Ethan alive for an upcoming ritual. Their conflict culminates in a final showdown that turns into a desperate fight for survival. Dimitrescu reveals a far more horrifying true form, transforming into a towering, dragon-like monster. The odds are overwhelming, but Ethan ultimately brings her down. In the aftermath, she leaves behind a mysterious flask, which Ethan quickly takes before escaping the castle. Outside, he reunites with the Duke, who explains what has happened to Rose and what Ethan must do to save her. Rose, Ethan learns, has been broken down into 4 separate flasks, with each part entrusted to one of the village's ruling lords. Ethan now has one of them, while the remaining 3 are still in the other's possession. The Duke insists that if Ethan can recover all 4, there is still a chance to restore Rose. With that goal in mind, Ethan heads out to collect the remaining flasks. At House Beneviento, he faces a kind of terror that is less about fighting and more about pure psychological torment. Donna Beneviento uses hallucinogenic influence to trap him in horrifying scenarios, including a grotesque, oversized infant that relentlessly pursues him through cramped, dim corridors, as well as sudden attacks from unsettling dolls that seem to move with a life of their own. Ethan endures the ordeal, breaks free of the hallucination's grips, kills Donna Beneviento, and takes the second flask. Next, he travels toward the reservoir to confront Salvatore Moreau. On the way, he crosses paths with Chris Redfield and the Hound Wolf Squad, who are also operating in the village and pursuing Miranda for reasons Ethan still does not fully understand. Ethan demands answers about Mia's death, but Chris refuses to explain and instead orders Ethan to leave. The tense exchange is interrupted when Moreau attacks in his monstrous mutated form. With Chris and his squad out of sight, Ethan resumes the pursuit, eventually facing Moreau in another brutal fight. Ethan kills him and secures the third flask containing a portion of Rose. Which of course means there's only one flask remaining, the one in Heisenberg's possession. Interestingly enough, however, it seems Heisenberg has his own plans in motion that don't necessarily align with those of Miranda, or the other, now dead lords. He contacts Ethan and makes him an offer. He will tell him where the fourth flask is and how to use all four to get Rose back if he helps Heisenberg with something in exchange. Now, what is that specifically? Well, we're going to get to that. Courtesy of intel provided by Heisenberg, Ethan heads to an old fort in the village where the fourth flask is being kept. He fights through a wave of lichens and beasts before finally finding the fourth flask. With all four of them now in his possession, as per Heisenberg's direction, he heads to his factory for a face-to-face conversation. That conversation, however, does not go well, to no one's surprise. When they meet, Heisenberg tells Ethan that unlike the other lords, he is not so much a willing servant of Miranda's. He resents her for having burdened him with his powers, and he has plans to take her out and rule on his own. And how exactly does he seek to do that? Well, that's where Rose comes in. Heisenberg tells Ethan that he will help revive Rose if Ethan agrees to letting him use the baby and her unique abilities, and more on those in a bit, to destroy Miranda, after which Ethan and Rose will be free to leave and never look back. Obviously, that does not sit right with Ethan. He has no intentions of helping Heisenberg, nor does he want his daughter being used as a weapon, but Heisenberg, as you might imagine, is not a man who reacts well to being told no. Heisenberg throws Ethan deep into the lowest levels of his enormous factory, leaving him with only one option: fight his way upward and escape. The facility is a sprawling maze packed with lethal machinery and hostile metal creatures that patrol its corridors, turning every step into a life or death struggle. Near the end of Ethan's time in the factory, he crosses paths with Chris again, and this time, Chris finally shares key information that he kept to himself for far too long. Ethan has every reason to feel that if Chris had been honest from the start, a great deal of this suffering might have never happened at all. Chris reveals the truth. Chris tells Ethan that Mia is still very much alive and currently in Miranda's captivity. So what the hell was up with him ruthlessly gunning Mia down right in front of Ethan back at the Winters residence? Well, it turns out that wasn't Mia. That was Miranda, who had shape-shifting abilities, among many others, and was successfully able to take Mia captive and swap places with her some time ago, and that without ever raising any suspicion even from Chris. And, well, what was her goal? Well, she wanted Rose. Why does Miranda want Rose so badly? Well, the answer stretches back more than a century. Over 100 years ago, Miranda was simply a woman living in a remote Eastern European village when tragedy struck. Her infant daughter, Eva, died during the Spanish flu pandemic. Overcome with grief and despair, Miranda eventually wandered into a cave with the intention of ending her own life. Instead, she discovered something extraordinary: a vast fungal supercolony known as the Mold. This was the same parasitic organism tied to the events of Resident Evil 7. At the heart of that underground growth was the megamycete, the central mass from which the mold originated. But the megamycete was more than just a biological anomaly. It retained fragments of the memories and consciousness of those that it came in contact with. Eva, who had been buried in the area, had also been absorbed into it, leaving behind a trace of her existence within the network. Miranda became convinced that the megamycete offered a path to resurrect her daughter. Consumed by that belief, she dedicated her life to studying and harnessing its power. Through her experiments, she gained extraordinary abilities and began attempting to create a suitable vessel for Eva's return.
The four lords were products of those efforts. Though each possessed formidable powers, none met Miranda's true objective. In her eyes, they were incomplete attempts in a much larger and far more personal mission. At some point, Miranda was also contacted by the organization known as the Connections, with whom she agreed to work on the mold and the Megamycete in order to further her own goals. It was through this work, in fact, that Eveline, the antagonist of Resident Evil 7, was created. It was also revealed at this point in Resident Evil Village that sometime in the 1950s, Miranda also started collaborating with none other than Oswald E. Spencer, the man who co-founded Umbrella Corporation. In fact, it was through his experiences with Miranda and his knowledge of the mold that Spencer would become obsessed with the idea of bioweapons and a new breed of humanity, which, of course, is what led to the creation of Umbrella, the T-Virus, and so much more. Eventually, after years of failed experiments, Miranda realized that she had found the perfect vessel through which she could revive Eva, Rose, who had inherited unique abilities that would make her the prime candidate for Eva's revival. Miranda's goal is to use Rose's remains in the flasks as part of a twisted ritual in conjunction with the Megamycete to bring Eva back. And what exactly is it that makes Rose so special? Well, we're going to get to that soon. Taking on Heisenberg. For the moment, Chris and Ethan, now finally on the same page, have a more urgent threat to handle, and that is Carl Heisenberg. Chris explains that the Hound Wolf squad had planted explosives throughout the factory, intending to destroy the entire complex. The strategy is simple. Chris and his team will finish setting everything in motion, while Ethan uses one of Heisenberg's own armored, tank-like machines to bring him down. After that, Ethan is meant to regroup with Chris so that they can move together against Miranda. Ethan faces Heisenberg outside of the factory in a chaotic, high-impact fight that ends with the final Lord defeated. Before Ethan can reunite with Chris, however, Miranda appears and reminds him just how far beyond human she truly is. She overwhelms him with terrifying ease, drives her hand into his chest, rips out his heart, and leaves him collapsing to the ground, seemingly lifeless. And yet, Ethan's story has never followed normal rules. Across Resident Evil 7 and Village, he survived injuries that should have been instantly fatal, repeatedly losing and reattaching limbs and recovering at an impossible pace. Even now, after something as extreme as having his heart torn out, he does not simply vanish from the story. Now, this is where the game finally explains why. On the edge of death, Ethan experiences a vision shaped by the Megamycete, one that unfolds inside his own mind. Through it, he learns a brutal truth. He's been dead for years. Nearly 4 years earlier, when he entered the Baker house searching for Mia, Jack Baker did more than knock him unconscious during that first encounter. Ethan was killed and then restored through the mold. The same organism has been keeping him functional ever since, granting him unnatural regenerative ability that has carried him through horrors no ordinary person could have survived. Now, crucially, the story also reveals that Rose inherited aspects of those properties as well, which is exactly why Miranda is so desperate to claim her. Ethan's sacrifice. But wait, there's more. After so many years of punishment, his body, which is by this point mostly mold, is crumbling. But though he is at death's door for real this time, Ethan knows that he isn't going to stop until he's saved Rose. He regains consciousness and finds himself in the back of the Duke's cart, who drops him off close to where Miranda is about to hold her final ceremony, which will see her using Rose, whom she's brought back to her infant self, to finally bring Eva back to life. While Chris and the Hound Wolf squad battle Miranda's followers and set an explosive charge on the Megamycete, Ethan confronts Miranda directly. Their final clash is brutal and overwhelming, but Ethan ultimately prevails, bringing Miranda's reign to an end at last. When it's over, he reaches Rose and gathers her into his arms, only for his strength to fade. His knees buckle and his body begins to break apart. Understanding that he is running out of time, Ethan entrusts Rose to Chris and orders him to get out of the village. Ethan stays behind to make sure the charge planted on the Megamycete detonates. Chris and his team evacuate by helicopter, and Mia, now safe, pleads with them to turn back for Ethan. There's no time and no safe way to return. The helicopter lifts off as the explosion goes off, wiping out the Megamycete and consuming the village.
Ethan's final choice is clear. He guarantees the blast, giving up on his own life so that his family can live, and bringing his story to a close with a sacrifice that is as definitive as it is heartbreaking, even if the lingering question of what exactly remains of him is left hanging. Back in the chopper, one of Chris's soldiers shows him the body of a BSAA agent, and it's shown that the soldier is very zombie-like in its appearance. The BSAA, it seems, is using BOW soldiers. Chris orders his soldiers to head to the BSAA's headquarters, and he's clearly pissed. And that's where Resident Evil Village's story ends, and where we jump into its DLC, Shadows of Rose, which is set several years later. Rose's Dilemma. The story takes place in 2037 and focuses on a 16-year-old Rose. Living under Chris and the BSAA's watchful eye and constant protection, and having to shoulder the burden of the unique powers she inherited from her father, Rose is an outcast in her world and wants nothing more than to get rid of her powers and live the life that she never could, that of a regular kid. As luck would have it, the chance to do just that is presented to her. Years later, Rose is approached by K9, one of the operatives from the Hound Wolf Squad, who tells her that not all of the Megamycete was destroyed in the village incident. A fragment of it survived. Within that lingering fungal network, he explains, exists something called the Purifying Crystal, an object that could permanently remove the strange abilities that she has carried since birth. Longing for a normal life, Rose agrees to enter the consciousness of the Megamycete in search of it. Inside, she's confronted by disturbing and deeply unsettling manifestations shaped by memory and trauma. As she struggles through these warped environments and relentless trials, she receives guidance from an unseen presence that refers to itself only as Michael, a silent ally whose true nature remains unclear. The twist. Eventually, Rose manages to find the Purifying Crystal, only to learn that things aren't exactly, or at all, what she expected. It turns out bits and pieces of Miranda's consciousness survived the village incident, and that she continued to hold on to her plans to revive her daughter, Eva. It is for that purpose, in fact, that she used Hound Wolf Squad's K9 as an illusion to lure Rose into the Megamycete, a trap that she fell into all too easily. Miranda is not the only consciousness lingering within the Megamycete. Ethan too has left behind a trace of himself inside the fungal network. It's eventually revealed that the presence guiding Rose under the name Michael has been her father all along, quietly helping her navigate the hostile landscape within the organism. With Ethan's support, Rose finally comes to terms with the abilities she once viewed as a curse. Rather than erasing them, she chooses acceptance. She destroys the Purifying Crystal and, alongside the remaining echo of her father, eliminates the last fragments of Miranda for good. After sharing a final moment together, Rose exits the Megamycete, with Ethan's remaining essence fading away. As Shadows of Rose concludes, it's revealed that Rose has joined the BSAA and is now training under Chris to better understand and control her powers. In the closing scene, she visits Ethan's grave before departing in a BSAA vehicle. In the distance, a lone figure approaches, a quiet and ambiguous image that hints at possibilities without offering a clear answer. This is speculated to be Ethan, indicating that he never died, but who really knows? And that's the full story of Resident Evil Village and Shadows of Rose, which together close off the Winters family saga, even though they do leave some doors open for potential future stories. According to the developer, the upcoming Resident Evil Requiem is set to go back to the series' overarching story, which has been out of focus for a long time now. Really, it hasn't been since Resident Evil 6 in 2013 and Revelations 2 in 2015 that we've really focused on the series' main storyline, with Resident Evil 7 and Village both taking a step away. So we are done with the entire Resident Evil saga, but what about some of the biggest mysteries, questions, and theories that the series has raised over the years? Well, in this exclusive bonus chapter, we address just that. There are so many potential story threads that Requiem has the chance to finally tie up, and its look into the truth of the Raccoon City incident is the perfect opportunity to achieve the closure that we've all been waiting for. We're more than excited to go back to the Raccoon City incident and learn more about it from the story of Resident Evil Requiem. But the franchise has snowballed into so much more over the years, and there are now so many potential avenues to explore in a narrative that's taking us back to a time when Alyssa Ashcroft was alive and continuing her battle against Umbrella. But there are also other open threads that have been left unanswered for a while, a result of the virus spreading into the hands of so many smaller folks in the wake of Umbrella's fall from grace. Our heroes have encountered quite a few of these samples over the years, events that have raised burning questions that we're hoping the franchise revisits in some form. This one's all about those questions, and our theories, so let's dive right in and look at what Requiem might be bringing to the table. Chris and the cliffhanger from Village. Although Leon's taking center stage in Requiem with style, we wouldn't say no to a bit of story involving Chris, and the revelation that the BSAA was using BOW soldiers that hit quite hard at the end of Village. We know that he headed straight to the organization's Europe headquarters for answers, but things have been too quiet on that front. We know that they exist, but there's nothing about who authorized their use in the field, and how deep the implications can be, both for Chris as well as the BSAA. The revelations could very well shake things up, perhaps even causing a rift in the organization's ranks. Perhaps the DSO has got wind of the whole thing, and is perhaps what brought Leon to his current investigation. Could it be that Victor Gideon is somehow involved, with Leon looking to find evidence of it, perhaps at the behest of Chris? Could the two of them be working together on it? Does the blotch on Leon's neck have anything to do with it? It's easy to see how the story in Requiem could help establish continuity with its predecessors while bringing another familiar face into the mix. Aside from the BSAA, we're quite suspicious of Blue Umbrella. The organization was involved in the story of Biohazard, publicly painted as a new company looking to clean up the mess its predecessor left behind with backing from the US government. It has also had access to combat data from BSAA operatives with the intent of improving their effectiveness in the field. What if it decided that controlled BOWs were the best solution to the more dangerous ones that are out there? Is Blue Umbrella really motivated by altruism, or could there be a hidden agenda just waiting for our heroes to discover? Could Elpis be connected to the organization somehow? We're kind of leaning towards the connections being connected to the organization, their work with Mia Winters showcasing how effectively they were able to operate from the shadows. Blue Umbrella would be a perfect front for the Syndicate to find a more lucrative market for an entirely new kind of bioweapon. They're tied to the mold research pipeline, looking into a strain of the virus that stands out with its ability to generate a sort of hive mind. There's no better way to make use of that power than a battalion of soldiers that are able to think and act as one in the field. The BSAA might just be a subject for its testing. Perhaps Chris could help blow the lid off of that secrecy and force the organization into the light. There's also the family, whose last big action was to kill several DSO agents in a car bombing, the only survivor being none other than Leon. Their connections to bioweapons and the mystery surrounding their new leader's identity is something that Requiem could easily explore, and perhaps even be why Leon returns to Raccoon City in the first place. We do know that he has his own motives for being there after all. Could Elpis be the common factor between all of these disparate threads, with Grace and Leon gradually uncovering a conspiracy that goes beyond them? Could Alyssa have been looking into any or all of them, with the consequences of her investigation being her death? You know that we're quite certain of the new stalker being connected to Grace, and the idea that Alyssa became an unwilling test subject isn't very far from us at any time. There's also the question of their network and the sheer logistical challenge involved in the spread of bioweapons under the noses of some very vigilant organizations like the BSAA and DSO. Blue Umbrella could simply be one part of a much larger supply chain, and Requiem might just be a story that catalyzes a more coordinated approach to bioterrorism that's tackled in future games. But of course, bioweapons and bioterror are only part of the fun in a Resident Evil story. There's also the science behind it all, and the methods to all of its madness that brings more open threads for us to speculate on. The theory to our theories. Resident Evil is frightening not only because of the horrors it brings us face to face with, but also because of the knowledge of how those terrors came into existence in the first place. And after the last couple of games, there's so much that we do not know about the mold and its source, the mutamycete. Yes, we saw Rose score quite the win against it in Village's DLC, but that wasn't near enough of an answer to its origins and current status in the franchise canon. From a Requiem-focused point of view, the fact that many of the zombies retain a bit of their personalities and routines from before they were infected has us wondering if the mold is a factor in all of it. Is it being used in a new strain with varying results of success? Could Alyssa have stumbled onto it during her investigations, her blood being discovered as a great match for strains using it, with Grace being the final key to that puzzle? The mold isn't just an infection. It's a warping of memory and consciousness into a network of connected individuals that function as one, no matter how unwilling they might have been upon first entering the exclusive club that it started. We're wondering what other powers it hides and whether there's going to be more of it in Requiem. Just like the mold, there's also the progenitor virus and research into the perfect tyrant to consider. On both fronts, there is a chance for Requiem to give us a ton of lore drops, and perhaps weave its cast into the story that stems from the attempt. We know that the progenitor virus has been at the root of a lot of problems over the course of the franchise, but its full history is something that could be quite interesting indeed. The same goes for the next stage of the Tyrant's evolution, with Victor Gideon being a key factor in that part of the story. We know that Tyrants exist, and the man's obsession with Elpis might just lead to a new variant. After all, the Tyrant's existence is about who still has the data to produce a smarter variant than the one before it. Could the new Stalker be connected to Tyrants in some form? Well, if there are going to be any answers to these questions, Raccoon City is the place to look for them. Stories lost to erasure. It's very interesting that Requiem is taking us back to the ruins of Raccoon City, while Grace and Leon's respective investigations are tying back to the story that started it all. Aside from the city being an obvious choice for a perfect stage for all of the above open threads that we've discussed so far, it's also one that has many unresolved ones of its own. Raccoon City might just have its own story to tell in Requiem, and that could be one that involves lore that the nuke didn't entirely erase. There could be so much that has been recovered, the act of which could have been done by any of the parties that we've mentioned so far, and so much that's just waiting for us to discover it. There's also a lot that could have been discovered but hidden behind classified materials. Elpis is an obvious contender for the biggest discovery among those particular bits of buried history. But what if there's more about outbreaks that were quietly scrubbed from the official records thanks to what they contained? Or smaller biohazards that weren't really reported but have played their part in shaping public opinion and policy. We're quite familiar with Alyssa's battle against Umbrella and how a lot of her work was discredited as part of a government-approved cover-up of the Raccoon City incident. Her past could be a perfect window of opportunity for us to discover more of the city's secret events that led up to its eventual obliteration. And in Raccoon City's past is another part of what we cannot wait to find out about in Requiem. Characters and wildcards who aren't confirmed, but could make a surprise appearance. Perhaps a potent combination of both. Expecting the unexpected. When we think of wildcards and Resident Evil, an obvious idea that pops up is a dormant sample in the hands of one of the organizations we've discussed, or one that's being used by a new entry to the franchise. Gideon is an obvious character who could bring out a new strain of the virus, one that brings its own twist to existing variants. But there could be other characters who fit that bill too. In Resident Evil, a single vial can reshape the franchise's meta-narrative by a lot. And as far as characters who stand to gain or lose a lot from a single vial, two come to mind as far as Requiem is concerned. Ada Wong is the first person that we're thinking of, as she's never too far away when Leon's involved in a story. She's also somebody whose loyalties are often murky, and having her and a new dormant strain of the virus could be a great narrative device, allowing the story to look back at the past while simultaneously charting a course for the future, provided she manages to escape with one without revealing her motivations. We could also see the beginnings of a new strain of Umbrella itself, moving it from a shady organization to a sort of collective of smaller organizations with aims that were similar to its original's vision. It makes us wonder if the new Umbrella isn't just a more decentralized version of its past self, moving past a well-known logo to a system that continues to fund and indulge in bioterrorism. Now that's a lingering question we think Requiem is going to effectively answer one way or another as its story unfolds. The threat continues. No matter what the developers and writers have decided to include or exclude from Requiem's plot, one thing is for certain. The game is sure to follow the franchise's overarching theme of danger that stems not from the monsters it introduces, but from the twisted minds that create them in the first place. After all, Resident Evil never ends the threat, it just changes who holds the keys, and that perhaps has helped the franchise endure over the years, and has led us to what might be its best installment yet with Requiem.
And that'll be about it for this one. If you guys like what we're doing at Gaming Vault, please consider subscribing to our channel, and I'll see you guys on the next video.